I remember the wind screaming past my ears before the impact shattered my ribs. Lying there on a hidden mountain ledge, choking on my own blood, I was about to cry out for help. But my wife clamped her bloody hand over my mouth. "Act dead," she whispered, her eyes wide with a terrifying calm. And when I heard my own son laughing 15 feet above us, I realized our fatal fall was no accident. Before I tell you how a father exacts revenge from the grave, let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the deadliest betrayals always come from your own blood. My name is Preston Cole. I am 75 years old. For 40 years, I broke my back on the sweltering asphalt of South Atlanta, turning a single beat-up delivery truck into a $50 million logistics empire. I have dealt with union strikes, cutthroat businessmen, and the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your very bones. I fought tooth and nail in a world that did not want a black man to succeed, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the pain of waking up on the side of a mountain with my chest crushed and my heart ripped out by my own flesh and blood. Consciousness did not return all at once. It came back in jagged, agonizing flashes. First there was the freezing mountain wind slicing through my torn jacket. Then came the metallic taste of blood pooling in the back of my throat. Every time I tried to draw a breath, a blinding white-hot pain shot through my ribcage. I was tangled in a thick web of sharp branches and jagged rocks. We had gone up to the Blue Ridge Mountains for a weekend getaway, a trip suggested by our son Trey and his wife Sloan. We were standing near the edge of a scenic overlook, looking down at the 100-foot drop. The next thing I knew, a hard, violent shove against my back sent me tumbling into the abyss. I opened my eyes, the world spinning in blurry circles. I expected to see the bottom of the gorge. Instead, I realized we had crashed through a dense canopy of ancient pine trees and landed on a wide, overgrown ledge hidden just 15 feet below the main trail. It was a miracle we had not fallen all the way down to the river. I turned my head slowly, every muscle screaming in protest. Beside me lay my wife, Vivian. She is 72 years old, a woman who has stood by my side through every struggle and every triumph. Her forehead was bleeding and her clothes were torn. Panic surged through me. I opened my mouth to groan, to call out her name and check if she was alive. Before I could make a sound, Vivian lunged forward. Her bloody hand clamped hard over my mouth. I panicked, my eyes wide with confusion. I looked at her face, expecting to see the delirium of a dying woman. But Vivian was not delirious. Her eyes were wide with terror, but beneath that terror burned a fierce, calculating fire. She pressed her face close to mine. "Do not say a word," she whispered, her voice barely a breath against my ear. "Play dead." I wanted to ask why, but then I heard it. The crunch of expensive hiking boots on the gravel just 15 feet above us. They were standing right on the edge of the cliff where we had just been standing. "Look down there." A woman's voice floated down, sharp and cold as ice. It was Sloan, my daughter-in-law. She is 34 years old, a beautiful white woman from a prominent old money real estate family in Atlanta. Trey had always been desperate to fit into her world, eager to shed his working-class roots to be accepted by the country club elite. I had paid for his private schools and his luxury cars, but it was never enough to satisfy his hunger for a different life. "Are they dead?" Sloan demanded, her tone completely devoid of human emotion. She sounded like she was inspecting a dent on a luxury car. "If he breathes a word to his lawyers before Monday, my father's firm goes under completely. We need the liquid cash from his company now, Trey." I lay there paralyzed. The physical agony of my shattered ribs was suddenly nothing compared to the crushing weight of her words. She was talking about my logistics firm. She was talking about stealing the empire I built with my own sweat to save her bankrupt father. I waited for my son to defend me. I waited for Trey, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had worked 80-hour weeks for, to scream at her, to climb down the cliff and save his parents. Instead, I heard my son sigh. It was a heavy, inconvenienced sound. "I cannot see them through the branches," Trey replied. His voice was steady, too steady. "But nobody survives a drop like that. They hit the rocks. It is over. It is over." Those 3 words shattered my soul into a million unrecoverable pieces. He was not panicked. He was not grieving. He was checking off a box on a murderous to-do list. "Are you sure?" Sloan pressed, her voice dripping with venom. "Because if your father survives and freezes the trust fund, we are both going to federal prison. I am not spending the best years of my life behind bars because your ghetto father survived a fall. He is 75 years old," Sloan Trey snapped back, not to defend me but to reassure her of my demise. His heart is probably giving out right now, even if the fall did not kill him instantly. Let us just go. We need to get back to the city and pack up the house before the police come knocking. We have to play the grieving family. Grieving family. I tasted more blood in my mouth. I wanted to roar. I wanted to climb up that rock face with my bare hands and drag him down to hell with me. I tensed my muscles, ready to push Vivian's hand away and let out a scream of pure hatred. But Vivian pressed harder, her gaze locking onto mine, shaking her head fiercely. She pinned me down with a surprising strength, forcing me to remain completely still. Above us, the gravel crunched again as they walked away from the edge. A few small stones tumbled down, bouncing off my shoulder, a final insult from the son who had just thrown me away. Moments later, the heavy engine of Trey's luxury SUV roared to life. The sound faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence so deep and heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. They were gone. My only child had just murdered me and driven away to steal my life's work. I closed my eyes, letting a single tear escape. It was not a tear of physical pain. It was the death of a father. In that freezing silence, the man who had loved Trey, the man who had forgiven all his arrogance and greed, died completely. What remained was just Preston Cole, the ruthless businessman who knew how to crush his enemies. I slowly reached up and pulled Vivian's hand away from my mouth. Why, I croaked, my voice rough and broken. Why did you stop me? I could have yelled. Somebody might have heard us on the trail. We could have had them arrested right now. Vivian sat up, slowly wincing as she favored her bruised shoulder. The terrified expression she had worn just moments ago vanished completely. She reached into her torn coat. The woman who I thought only cared about gardening and Sunday church services looked at me with the cold precision of a military tactician. If we call the police right now, Preston, what exactly do we have? She asked, her voice steady and sharp. We have a tragic hiking accident. They will claim we slipped. Trey will hire the best lawyers in Atlanta with our own money. He will cry in front of a judge and say it was a terrible tragedy. We have no physical proof that they pushed us. I stared at my wife of 50 years, completely stunned by her composure. How can you be so calm? I wheezed, clutching my ribs. Our son just tried to kill us. Vivian did not answer immediately. Instead, she grabbed the torn lining of her heavy winter coat and ripped it open completely. Tucked neatly inside a hidden inner pocket was a small black device with a blinking green light, a GPS tracker, and right next to it, a miniature digital audio recorder. I have been recording them for a month, Preston, Vivian whispered, pulling the devices out and holding them in her bloody hands. I knew Sloane's family was secretly bankrupt. I knew they were planning something desperate to get their hands on your company. My jaw dropped. I forgot about the pain in my chest. You knew, I asked, my mind spinning. Why did you not tell me? Because you would not have believed me, she said, looking me dead in the eye. You have always had a blind spot for Trey. You wanted to believe he was a good man who just made a few arrogant choices. But I saw the way Sloane looked at our assets. I heard the whispered phone calls. I knew they were trying to figure out how to bypass the trust fund. She looked up at the edge of the cliff, the evening shadows beginning to lengthen across the sky. The fall was their idea. She continued, her voice devoid of any warmth. I heard them planning to bring us to this specific overlook. They thought it was a straight drop to the river. She turned her gaze back to me, the blinking green light of the tracker reflecting in her eyes. But I spent 3 days researching the topography of this trail. I knew about this overgrown ledge. I made sure we stood exactly above it when they made their move. The fall was their idea, Preston, but the ledge was mine. A freezing gust of wind swept across the mountain, but the chill that went down my spine had nothing to do with the weather. My wife had anticipated our own attempted murder and orchestrated our survival just to trap our son. We have to stay dead, Preston. Vivian said, her voice hard as steel. If we are dead, they get sloppy. If we are dead, they will try to liquidate your company illegally. And when they do, we will have all the federal evidence we need to lock them away for the rest of their miserable lives. I lay there on the cold, hard earth looking at the woman I had married half a century ago. She was right. A simple arrest for assault would not be enough. They wanted to take my empire. Now I was going to let them try. And once they had the rope firmly around their own necks, I was going to kick the chair out from under them. Let them think they won, I whispered, tasting the blood on my teeth. Let them drink champagne on our graves tonight. Vivian nodded, reaching for the blinking GPS tracker. She pressed a small button on the side. I just sent the emergency signal, she said. He should be here in 20 minutes. Who? I asked, shivering as the adrenaline began to wear off. Who do you think? She replied. I told Kendrick to park his truck 2 miles down the service road and wait for my signal. We are going off the grid tonight. I closed my eyes as the reality of our new existence settled in. We were no longer Preston and Vivian Cole. We were ghosts. And ghosts do not forgive. Ghosts only return to haunt the living. The wind up here did not just blow. It bit into your skin like broken glass. I lay against the damp earth, my breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Every time my chest expanded, it felt like a rusted knife twisting between my ribs. Vivian, my sweet Vivian, who I thought spent her days planning charity galas and pruning rose bushes, was moving with the ruthless efficiency of a combat medic. She snapped a thick pine branch over her knee. The sharp crack echoed in the suffocating silence of the mountain, a sound so violent it made me flinch. Hold still, Preston, she whispered, tearing a long strip of fabric from her ruined cashmere sweater. She bound the makeshift splint tightly against my ribcage. I bit down on the inside of my cheek hard enough to draw fresh blood, swallowing a scream. I am no stranger to pain. 40 years ago, when I bought my first second-hand delivery truck, I blew a tire on Interstate 20. The jack slipped and crushed my hand. I wrapped it in a dirty rag, changed that tire with one good arm, and drove another 300 miles because failure meant my family would not eat. I built a $50 million logistics empire on the back of that kind of agony. But the physical pain of crushed bones was nothing compared to the absolute devastation of knowing my only child had just tried to erase me from the earth. Why, I rasped, my voice barely more than a gravelly whisper. Why would Trey do this? He had the trust fund. He had the vice president title at my company. He had everything a black man in Atlanta could ever dream of handing down to his son. Vivian tied off the knot on my chest and looked at me. The moonlight caught the dried blood smeared across her cheek. Because having a seat at the table was not enough for Sloane, she said, her voice dropping to a freezing register. And Trey is so desperate for her approval, so desperate to be accepted by that old white money elite, that he became her executioner. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the depth of the rot. Sloane Vanderbilt. Her family name was stamped on half the historic buildings downtown. They looked down their noses at us at every country club dinner, treating me like the hired help who somehow stumbled into the VIP lounge. But Vivian had seen right through their tailored suits and forced smiles. The Vanderbilts are broke, Preston, Vivian said, leaning in close so the wind would not carry her words away. I hired a forensic accountant 3 weeks ago when I noticed discrepancies in our corporate tax filings. Sloane's father lost everything in a series of disastrous commercial real estate gambles 2 years ago. They have been quietly liquidating assets just to keep up appearances. They are drowning in debt. Sloane did not marry Trey for love. She married him because your $50 million freight company is the only lifeboat big enough to save her family from total ruin. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The sudden push for a quick wedding last year. Sloane's constant subtle remarks about how I needed to step down and let Trey take the reins. The way Trey started criticizing the very same diesel-stained boots and blue-collar grit that paid for his Ivy League tuition. My son had not just betrayed me. He had sold out his own legacy to bail out a family that despised us. He traded his father's life for a pat on the back from a bankrupt aristocrat. A sudden violent rage surged through my veins, burning away the freezing cold. The betrayal was a poison, and the only antidote I knew was action. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, fighting through the blinding pain in my chest. "Help me up, Vivian," I growled, my voice shaking with a fury I had never known. "We are climbing out of here. We are going to walk to the highway flag down a state trooper, and we are going to put our son in handcuffs tonight. I want him in a cell. I want to look him in the eyes while they read him his rights." I tried to stand, but my legs gave out. Vivian caught me, pushing me firmly back against the dirt. "No," she ordered. Her tone was absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. "You are not thinking like the man who built an empire, Preston. You are thinking like a wounded father. If we walk out of this forest right now, what happens?" I glared at her, my breathing heavy and strained. "Attempted murder happens. I will testify. You will testify. We will bury them under the prison." Vivian shook her head, her eyes flashing with a dark, terrifying intelligence. "And Trey will hire the best defense attorneys in the state using our own money. He will put on a tailored suit and cry in front of a jury. He will say it was a tragic accident. He will say we slipped near the edge and he tried to grab us but failed. It will be our word against theirs. A tragic hiking accident. At best, he gets a slap on the wrist for negligence. We have no physical proof of his intent. She grabbed the lapels of my torn coat, forcing me to focus solely on her. If we want justice, if we want to destroy them completely, we have to stay dead. Stay dead. I choked out the words, tasting copper. Are you out of your mind? If we stay dead, they take the company. They take the house. They win. No, Vivian countered smoothly. If we stay dead, they get sloppy. They need liquid cash immediately to save the Vanderbilt estate. They cannot wait for a lengthy probate process. To get that money, Trey is going to have to bypass the trust fund. He is going to have to forge your signature. He is going to have to commit federal wire fraud and grand larceny. If we are alive, he plays the grieving victim of an accident. If we are dead, he acts like a thief. We let him steal it. We let him commit the federal crimes. And when he has the rope wrapped tightly around his own neck, we kick the chair out from under him. I lay there shivering against the damp earth, absorbing the lethal perfection of her plan. She was absolutely right. A simple assault charge would never be enough. They wanted my empire. I was going to let them choke on it. I looked at my wife with a newfound reverence. For 50 years, I thought I was the ruthless one in this marriage. I was wrong. The woman I married was a master tactician, and she had just drawn the battle lines. The wind howled through the gorge, dropping the temperature even further. My extremities were going numb. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the agonizing throb of my broken ribs. Every rustle of the pine needles sounded like a predator creeping closer. We were sitting ducks on this ledge. If Trey realized we had not hit the river at the bottom of the ravine, he might come back to finish the job. The silence of the mountain was playing tricks on my mind. Suddenly, the crunch of dry leaves and loose gravel broke the steady rhythm of the wind. It was not coming from the cliff edge above us. It was coming from below. Someone was climbing up the steep, rocky incline toward our hidden ledge. Vivian froze her hand, instinctively reaching out to grip my arm. I held my breath, ignoring the stabbing pain in my chest. I forced myself to a crouch, my hands desperately searching the dark ground until my fingers wrapped around a heavy, jagged stone. I am 75 years old and my chest was crushed, but I swore to God I was not going to die without taking a piece of them with me. If Trey had sent someone down to finish the job, I was going to cave their skull in. A narrow beam of a high-powered flashlight sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the trunks of the pine trees. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, slipping slightly on the damp rocks. The beam of light hit the dirt just inches from Vivian's boots. I raised the jagged stone, my muscles coiling with the last reserve of my strength ready to strike. The flashlight beam lifted, hitting me right in the eyes, blinding me for a split second. I braced for the attack. Then a low, raspy voice cut through the freezing wind. "Mr. Cole, put the rock down, boss. It is Kendrick. Kendrick, my head of security. A man who had been with me for 2 decades. A man who answered only to me and my wife. The cavalry had arrived and the war for my legacy had officially begun. The wind up here did not just blow. It bit into your skin like broken glass. I lay against the damp earth, my breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Every time my chest expanded, it felt like a rusted knife twisting between my ribs. Vivian, my sweet Vivian, who I thought spent her days planning charity galas and pruning rose bushes, was moving with the ruthless efficiency of a combat medic. She snapped a thick pine branch over her knee. The sharp crack echoed in the suffocating silence of the mountain, a sound so violent it made me flinch. "Hold still, Preston," she whispered, tearing a long strip of fabric from her ruined cashmere sweater. She bound the makeshift splint tightly against my ribcage. I bit down on the inside of my cheek hard enough to draw fresh blood, swallowing a scream. I am no stranger to pain. 40 years ago, when I bought my first second-hand delivery truck, I blew a tire on Interstate 20. The jack slipped and crushed my hand. I wrapped it in a dirty rag, changed that tire with one good arm, and drove another 300 miles because failure meant my family would not eat. I built a $50 million logistics empire on the back of that kind of agony. But the physical pain of crushed bones was nothing compared to the absolute devastation of knowing my only child had just tried to erase me from the earth. Why I rasped my voice barely more than a gravelly whisper. Why would Trey do this? He had the trust fund. He had the vice president title at my company. He had everything a black man in Atlanta could ever dream of handing down to his son. Vivian tied off the knot on my chest and looked at me. The moonlight caught the dried blood smeared across her cheek. Because having a seat at the table was not enough for Sloane, she said, her voice dropping to a freezing register. And Trey is so desperate for her approval, so desperate to be accepted by that old white money elite that he became her executioner. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the depth of the rot. Sloane Vanderbilt. Her family name was stamped on half the historic buildings downtown. They looked down their noses at us at every country club dinner, treating me like the hired help who somehow stumbled into the VIP lounge. But Vivian had seen right through their tailored suits and forced smiles. "The Vanderbilts are broke, Preston," Vivian said, leaning in close so the wind would not carry her words away. "I hired a forensic accountant 3 weeks ago when I noticed discrepancies in our corporate tax filings. Sloane's father lost everything in a series of disastrous commercial real estate gambles 2 years ago. They have been quietly liquidating assets just to keep up appearances. They are drowning in debt. Sloane did not marry Trey for love. She married him because your $50 million freight company is the only lifeboat big enough to save her family from total ruin." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The sudden push for a quick wedding last year. Sloane's constant subtle remarks about how I needed to step down and let Trey take the reins. The way Trey started criticizing the very same diesel-stained boots and blue-collar grit that paid for his Ivy League tuition. My son had not just betrayed me. He had sold out his own legacy to bail out a family that despised us. He traded his father's life for a pat on the back from a bankrupt aristocrat. A sudden violent rage surged through my veins, burning away the freezing cold. The betrayal was a poison, and the only antidote I knew was action. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, fighting through the blinding pain in my chest. "Help me up, Vivian," I growled, my voice shaking with a fury I had never known. "We are climbing out of here. We are going to walk to the highway flag, down a state trooper, and we are going to put our son in handcuffs tonight. I want him in a cell. I want to look him in the eyes while they read him his rights." I tried to stand, but my legs gave out. Vivian caught me, pushing me firmly back against the dirt. "No," she ordered. Her tone was absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. "You are not thinking like the man who built an empire, Preston. You are thinking like a wounded father. If we walk out of this forest right now, what happens?" I glared at her, my breathing heavy and strained. "Attempted murder happens. I will testify. You will testify. We will bury them under the prison." Vivian shook her head, her eyes flashing with a dark, terrifying intelligence. "And Trey will hire the best defense attorneys in the state using our own money. He will put on a tailored suit and cry in front of a jury. He will say it was a tragic accident. He will say we slipped near the edge and he tried to grab us but failed. It will be our word against theirs. A tragic hiking accident. At best, he gets a slap on the wrist for negligence. We have no physical proof of his intent." She grabbed the lapels of my torn coat, forcing me to focus solely on her. "If we want justice, if we want to destroy them completely, we have to stay dead." "Stay dead." I choked out the words, tasting copper. "Are you out of your mind? If we stay dead, they take the company. They take the house. They win." "No," Vivian countered smoothly. "If we stay dead, they get sloppy. They need liquid cash immediately to save the Vanderbilt estate. They cannot wait for a lengthy probate process. To get that money, Trey is going to have to bypass the trust fund. He is going to have to forge your signature. He is going to have to commit federal wire fraud and grand larceny. If we are alive, he plays the grieving victim of an accident. If we are dead, he acts like a thief. We let him steal it. We let him commit the federal crimes. And when he has the rope wrapped tightly around his own neck, we kick the chair out from under him." I lay there shivering against the damp earth, absorbing the lethal perfection of her plan. She was absolutely right. A simple assault charge would never be enough. They wanted my empire. I was going to let them choke on it. I looked at my wife with a newfound reverence. For 50 years, I thought I was the ruthless one in this marriage. I was wrong. The woman I married was a master tactician, and she had just drawn the battle lines. The wind howled through the gorge, dropping the temperature even further. My extremities were going numb. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the agonizing throb of my broken ribs. Every rustle of the pine needles sounded like a predator creeping closer. We were sitting ducks on this ledge. If Trey realized we had not hit the river at the bottom of the ravine, he might come back to finish the job. The silence of the mountain was playing tricks on my mind. Suddenly, the crunch of dry leaves and loose gravel broke the steady rhythm of the wind. It was not coming from the cliff edge above us. It was coming from below. Someone was climbing up the steep rocky incline toward our hidden ledge. Vivian froze her hand, instinctively reaching out to grip my arm. I held my breath, ignoring the stabbing pain in my chest. I forced myself to a crouch, my hands desperately searching the dark ground until my fingers wrapped around a heavy, jagged stone. I am 75 years old and my chest was crushed, but I swore to God I was not going to die without taking a piece of them with me. If Trey had sent someone down to finish the job, I was going to cave their skull in. A narrow beam of a high-powered flashlight sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the trunks of the pine trees. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, slipping slightly on the damp rocks. The beam of light hit the dirt just inches from Vivian's boots. I raised the jagged stone, my muscles coiling with the last reserve of my strength ready to strike. The flashlight beam lifted, hitting me right in the eyes, blinding me for a split second. I braced for the attack. Then a low, raspy voice cut through the freezing wind. "Mr. Cole, put the rock down, boss. It is Kendrick." Kendrick, my head of security. A man who had been with me for 2 decades. A man who answered only to me and my wife. The cavalry had arrived and the war for my legacy had officially begun. The word Kendrick hung in the freezing mountain air like a lifeline thrown into a raging ocean. I blinked against the harsh glare of the flashlight. As my eyes adjusted to the sudden light, the massive silhouette of my head of security materialized from the darkness. Kendrick is a man carved from solid granite, an ex-military operative who has been watching my back for 2 decades. He did not gasp. He did not ask what happened. He took one look at my shattered chest, the blood soaking through Vivian's torn cashmere and the sheer drop of the cliff above us, and he understood the entire story in a single heartbeat. "We need to move, boss," Kendrick said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that offered no room for panic. He slung a heavy canvas duffel bag off his broad shoulders. He pulled out a specialized climbing harness, moving with a cold, mechanical efficiency. "I am going to have to strap this around your chest. It is going to hurt worse than the fall. But if we stay on this ledge, the temperature drop will kill you before morning." I nodded, biting down hard on my lower lip. "Do it," I rasped. When Kendrick pulled the nylon straps tight across my broken ribs, a blinding white agony exploded behind my eyes. The pain was so absolute, so complete, that for a moment the world simply vanished into static. I tasted fresh copper in my mouth. I felt Vivian's warm hand gripping my shoulder, anchoring me to the earth. She was whispering prayers mixed with promises of vengeance. The descent was a brutal, agonizing crawl through hell. For over an hour we navigated the treacherous, jagged spine of the mountain. Every step I took sent shockwaves of fire radiating through my torso. Branches whipped across my face. Loose gravel gave way beneath my boots, threatening to send us plunging into the black river winding through the gorge below. Kendrick practically carried half my body weight, his massive arm locked like an iron vise around my waist. Vivian climbed ahead of us, clearing a path through the dense underbrush, her hands scraped and bleeding, but her focus unbroken. As I stumbled through the freezing darkness, my physical torture became a mirror for the emotional slaughter happening in my mind. With every agonizing step, memories of my son assaulted me. I remembered carrying Trey on my shoulders through the crowded streets of downtown Atlanta when he was 4 years old, buying him roasted peanuts, telling him that one day he would own the skyline. I remembered working 36-hour shifts, sleeping in the cab of a freezing delivery truck, eating stale sandwiches just so I could pay his tuition at an elite private academy. I did not want my boy to suffer the indignities I faced. I wanted him to walk into a room and command respect. I gave him the world on a silver platter, and his gratitude was a violent shove into the abyss orchestrated by a woman who despised our very existence. By the time we reached the bottom of the ravine, my clothes were soaked in a cold, morbid sweat. Hidden beneath the thick canopy of weeping willows parked illegally on an abandoned logging road was Kendrick's vehicle, a massive matte black armored SUV. The engine was already quietly purring. Kendrick slid the heavy side door open and hoisted me into the back seat. Vivian climbed in beside me, instantly pulling a thick thermal blanket over my shivering frame. Kendrick threw the vehicle into gear and we vanished into the night, leaving no trace that Preston and Vivian Cole had ever survived the fall. The ride back to Atlanta was entombed in a suffocating silence. The heater blasted warm air over my frozen skin, but the chill in my soul was permanent. I stared out the tinted window as the towering pine trees gave way to the concrete arteries of the city. We were not heading toward the wealthy, manicured estates of Buckhead where I lived. Kendrick was steering us deep into the industrial heart of South Atlanta. The crumbling brick warehouses, the graffiti-stained overpasses, the rusted chain-link fences. This was my old neighborhood. This was the gritty, unforgiving soil where I planted the seeds of my empire 40 years ago. The SUV rolled down a deserted alleyway and approached a massive, unmarked corrugated metal warehouse. Kendrick pressed a button on his visor. The heavy steel bay doors ground open, swallowing our vehicle into the darkness before slamming shut behind us. When I stepped out of the SUV, leaning heavily on Kendrick, I blinked in astonishment. The exterior of the building looked like a forgotten relic, but the inside was a high-tech fortress. The cavernous space was dimly lit by fluorescent bulbs hanging from the rafters. There was a makeshift medical triage station set up in the corner, complete with oxygen tanks and surgical supplies. But what caught my attention immediately was the back wall. It was covered end to end with large, flat-screen monitors currently displaying nothing but pitch-black static. Kendrick guided me to a medical cot. He cut away my ruined shirt with trauma shears and began cleaning the deep lacerations on my chest, preparing to properly wrap my fractured ribs. Vivian stood by the bank of monitors, her arms crossed, her eyes hard and unreadable. "What is this place?" I asked, gritting my teeth as Kendrick applied antiseptic to a deep gash on my collarbone. "This is the Ghost Protocol, boss," Kendrick replied without looking up from his work. "Miss Vivian told me to lease this space under a shell corporation a month ago. She told me to equip it for a long stay." I looked at my wife, the woman I thought I knew completely. "You set up a safe house a month ago?" I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. Vivian walked slowly toward the center of the room. "A safe house is just the beginning, Preston. I told you I knew Sloan and Trey were planning a hostile takeover, but I needed to know exactly how they were going to bypass your lawyers and seize the company assets. I needed to see their playbook." She gestured toward the massive wall of blank monitors. 3 weeks ago, while Trey and Sloan were pretending to go wine tasting in Napa Valley, I had Kendrick bypass the security grid at our estate. My breath caught in my throat. "You bugged our own home." Vivian did not flinch. "I wired every single room that matters. There are hidden wide-angle micro cameras seamlessly blended into the crown molding of the main living room, the formal dining room, and your private master study. There are high-fidelity audio bugs inside the crystal chandeliers. They are transmitting a secure encrypted live feed directly to these servers. I built a rat trap, Preston, and our son just walked right into the cheese." I stared at the black screens. The very idea that my own home, the sanctuary I built for my family, was now a surveillance zone felt surreal. Yet it was the only thing standing between my legacy and total annihilation. "Turn them on," I commanded, pointing a trembling, blood-stained finger at the monitors. "Show me my house." Kendrick stopped wrapping my ribs. He stood up to his full, imposing height and looked at me with deep concern. "Boss," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who has seen too much tragedy. "You do not want to see this right now. Your body is in severe trauma. Your blood pressure is erratic. Let me give you something for the pain. Let me give you a sedative. You can watch the recordings tomorrow." I pushed myself up from the cot, fighting through a wave of nauseating dizziness. I grabbed Kendrick by the forearm, my grip fueled by pure, unadulterated fury. "The physical pain is nothing." I snarled, locking eyes with my oldest friend. "My son just threw me off a mountain. He thinks I am rotting at the bottom of a river. I need to see his face. I need to see the monster I raised. Turn the damn screens on Kendrick." "That is a direct order." Kendrick stared at me for a long moment. He recognized the tone. It was the same tone I used when I crushed my corporate rivals. He gave a slow, reluctant nod and stepped over to the master control console. With the flick of a heavy switch, the warehouse hummed with electrical power. The massive wall of monitors flickered from pitch black to brilliant high-definition color. My heart hammered against my shattered ribs. There it was, my home, the grand foyer, the marble kitchen, and right in the center of the grid, the feed from my private master study. The rich mahogany walls, the Persian rugs, the massive oak desk where I had negotiated millions of dollars in freight contracts. The study door swung open. I stopped breathing entirely. In walked Trey and Sloan. They had just driven back from the mountains. They had just committed a double homicide, yet their clothes were completely pristine. There was no dirt on their designer jackets. There was no frantic, breathless panic. And most damning of all, there was absolutely no grief. Their faces were perfectly, terrifyingly calm. Trey did not collapse in tears. He did not look at the framed family portraits on the wall. He walked directly past them as if they were invisible. He went straight to my antique glass front liquor cabinet, He bypassed the everyday scotch and reached to the very top shelf. He pulled out a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon. It was a $2,000 bottle I had kept sealed for 10 years, explicitly saving it to open on my 50th wedding anniversary with Vivian. Trey popped the cork with a satisfying, echoing thud. He pulled 2 heavy crystal tumblers from the shelf and poured generous amber measures. He handed one glass to his wife. Sloane took the glass. Her flawless, pale face glowed with a sinister, radiant triumph. She looked around my study, her eyes sweeping over my leather chair and my private files with the greedy satisfaction of a conquering general standing on the ashes of a burned city. She stepped close to my son, a wicked smile stretching across her lips. She raised her crystal glass, the amber liquid catching the light of the chandelier, and she spoke the words that will echo in my nightmares until the day I take my final breath. To the new king of Atlanta. I stared at the monitor and watched the amber liquid in my son's glass catch the light of the chandelier. He raised it in the air. He smiled a perfect and relaxed smile. Then he drank. He swallowed the $2,000 bourbon I had saved for my 50th wedding anniversary. He drank to my death. He drank to his mother's death. I watched his throat move as he swallowed the expensive liquor. I waited for a tear to fall. I waited for his hands to shake. I waited for the crushing weight of patricide to drop him to his knees in the middle of my study. But nothing happened. He just poured himself another glass. The agonizing pain in my shattered ribs suddenly faded away. A freezing cold numbness took its place. For 38 years I had carried that boy in my heart. I had forgiven his arrogance. I had paid for his mistakes. I had defended him when the world told me he was too soft and too spoiled. But standing in that dark warehouse watching him celebrate my murder, I felt the last drop of a father's love evaporate completely into the cold air. I was no longer a father looking at his son. I was a chief executive officer looking at a corporate spy. I was a man looking at a thief who had broken into my house. Sloane set her glass down on my mahogany desk. She did not use a coaster. It was a small, careless detail, but it spoke volumes. She had absolutely zero respect for anything I had built. She walked over to the grand fireplace mantel. Vivian had spent years arranging that mantel. It was covered in heavy silver frames holding our entire family history. There were pictures of my grandfather who picked cotton in the brutal Georgia sun until his hands bled. There were pictures of Vivian's mother who cleaned houses for wealthy white families so Vivian could afford to go to college. There were pictures of our wedding day when we had nothing but $50 and a massive dream. Sloane picked up the photo of my grandfather. She stared at the black and white image of a proud, hard-working black man with a look of absolute disgust on her flawless pale face. Then she walked into the kitchen and came back with a heavy black trash bag. She opened the bag and dropped my grandfather inside. The sound of the silver frame hitting the bottom of the plastic bag echoed sharply through the hidden microphone. I felt Vivian stiffen beside me in the warehouse. She did not cry, but I could hear her breathing turn shallow and fast. Sloane moved down the mantel, sweeping generations of our family history into the garbage like it was infected waste. Finally, she wiped her hands together and looked at Trey. Finally, she said, "We can get rid of this ghetto aesthetic. We need to completely sanitize this place before my parents arrive." Sanitize. She used the word sanitize as if my family was a disease. As if the blood and the sweat of black men and women who survived the brutal realities of segregation to build a $50 million empire was just dirt on her expensive designer shoes. I turned my eyes to Trey on the screen. I wanted to see him explode. I wanted to see him snatch that garbage bag out of her hands and defend the grandmother who baked him sweet potato pies every Sunday. I wanted him to defend the grandfather whose name he carried with pride. I wanted to see a spark of the proud black man I tried to raise. But Trey did not move to stop her. He took another slow sip of bourbon and nodded. "You are right," he said, looking around the room with a sneer of contempt. "We will hire a high-end interior designer tomorrow morning. We need to make this place look presentable. We need to make it look like a modern estate." I stopped breathing for a moment. The ultimate betrayal was not the violent push off the edge of the mountain. The ultimate betrayal was watching my own flesh and blood completely erase his own history just to please a woman who hated what he was. Trey was a black man who grew up in the lap of absolute luxury because his father broke his back in the dangerous freight yards of South Atlanta. I gave him the world. I gave him access to exclusive rooms I had to fight my way into with bruised knuckles. and his gratitude was to wipe our existence from the walls and call his own history a ghetto aesthetic. He was not a victim of Sloane's emotional manipulation. He was a willing, eager accomplice. He craved the validation of her white elite world so deeply that he was willing to kill his parents and throw their pictures in the trash just to secure his seat at their bankrupt table. He hated his roots. He hated me. We watched the monitors in silence for hours. Kendrick stood in the deep shadows of the warehouse like a stone statue carved from obsidian. His massive arms were crossed over his chest and his eyes were locked on the screen with a lethal intensity. Vivian sat in a cold metal folding chair staring at the monitors with eyes that looked like shattered glass. Neither of us spoke a single word. There were no words left to say. The shock had burned away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of our new existence. We simply watched the two murderers roam freely through our home. They went upstairs to our master bedroom. They opened Vivian's antique jewelry boxes. Sloane tried on my wife's favorite diamond necklace and laughed in front of the full-length mirror, admiring her stolen loot. Trey opened my walk-in closet and started throwing my expensive tailored suits onto the floor to make room for his own clothes. They were nesting in our graves. The clock on the warehouse wall ticked loudly past midnight. Then it struck 1 in the morning. The quiet hum of the server racks was the only sound in our dark sanctuary. At exactly 2 in the morning, the security cameras outside the mansion gates triggered a silent alert on our screens. A sleek black luxury sedan pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates. Trey had already given them the master access code. The gates swung open smoothly and the car drove up the long, winding driveway, parking right next to Trey's SUV. The heavy front doors of the mansion opened and in walked Richard and Victoria Vanderbilt, Sloane's parents. They did not look like people arriving in the middle of the night to comfort their grieving daughter. They looked like desperate loan sharks coming to collect a massive debt. Richard Vanderbilt was a tall, imposing man wearing an expensive tailored trench coat. He carried a massive leather briefcase gripped tightly in his pale hands. Victoria Vanderbilt walked in looking around my elegant foyer with the exact same expression of disdain her daughter had used earlier. Trey rushed down the sweeping marble staircase to greet them. He looked eager to please, like a desperate low-level employee greeting the Supreme Board of Directors. "Good evening, Richard," Trey said, extending his hand with a nervous, eager smile. Richard Vanderbilt did not shake my son's hand. He completely ignored the gesture, leaving Trey's hand hanging awkwardly in the air. Richard walked straight past him, heading directly into my private study as if he already owned the place. The rest of them followed like obedient, silent dogs. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart pounding fiercely against my broken ribs. Richard Vanderbilt dropped his heavy leather briefcase right on top of my immaculate mahogany desk. He popped the brass latches and pulled out a massive, thick stack of legal documents, dropping them with a loud thud that echoed through the room. He looked at Trey with cold, calculating, desperate eyes. Richard did not ask how the hiking trip went. He did not ask if we suffered when we fell. He did not ask if the police were getting suspicious about the missing bodies. He looked at the open liquor cabinet, then looked back at Trey with intense pressure. "We are out of time, Trey," Richard said, his voice echoing sharply through the hidden microphones. "The banks are threatening to seize our commercial properties by the end of the month. The grace period is over. I have a buyer lined up for your father's trucking fleet, a private overseas buyer who pays in untraceable liquid cash. We need the entire fleet liquidated by Friday." Trey stared at the massive stack of papers, looking slightly nervous for the first time all night. But Richard Trey stammered, his voice losing its confident edge. "The bodies have not even been found yet. The police are still searching the river gorge. If I sign these transfer documents now, it might look highly suspicious to the authorities." Richard Vanderbilt leaned heavily over my desk, invading Trey's space, pressing his total psychological dominance over my weak son. "I do not care how it looks," Richard hissed, his face turning red with financial desperation. "Sign the power of attorney now before the bodies are even found." The heavy silence of the warehouse was only broken by the low hum of the computer servers and my own shallow breathing. I stared at the high-definition monitor showing my private study. Richard Vanderbilt stood over my mahogany desk like a vulture circling a fresh carcass. He did not look like a grieving family member. He looked like a man who was drowning and had just found a raft. Unfortunately for him, that raft was built out of my blood and sweat. Trey looked at the massive stack of legal papers Richard had thrown on the desk. My son, the boy I had raised to command boardrooms, was shrinking. He was physically folding in on himself, intimidated by a man who did not have a dime to his name. Richard Vanderbilt was bankrupt. His historic real estate firm was a hollow shell kept alive by smoke and mirrors. But Trey did not care about the math. Trey cared about the pedigree. He cared about the approval of the white elite. Listen to me carefully. Trey Richard commanded, his voice echoing through the hidden microphones Vivian had planted in the chandelier. The grace period with the banks expired yesterday. We are holding off total foreclosure by a thread. The commercial properties downtown are going to be seized by Monday if we do not inject $30 million of liquid capital into the holding accounts. Sloane stood next to her father, her arms crossed her face, a mask of cold entitlement. She looked at Trey with an expectation that was heavier than any physical threat. "We need the money, Trey," she said smoothly. "That was the whole point of this weekend. You promised me we would be secure." I watched my son swallow hard. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead. But Richard Trey stammered, his voice lacking any of the authority I had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to instill in him. "The logistics company is locked inside my father's corporate trust. I cannot just transfer $30 million. The legal department will block it. The board of directors will demand an inquiry. The police have not even found their bodies yet." Richard slammed his open palm against the polished wood of my desk. The loud smack made Trey flinch. "I do not care about your board of directors," Richard hissed, leaning so close to my son that I could see the spit flying from his lips on the camera feed. "You are the executive vice president. I have brought you the solution. I have a buyer, a private overseas syndicate willing to purchase 200 of your father's semi-trucks. They will pay above market value, and they will pay in untraceable offshore cash. They do not care about the paperwork delays, and they do not care about the police search. They want the fleet, and they will wire the funds directly to the account routing numbers I have provided in those documents." My chest tightened so painfully I thought my heart was going to give out. I knew exactly what kind of overseas syndicate buys 200 commercial freight trucks in cash without asking questions. Cartels, money launderers, shadow organizations that use massive shipping fleets to move contraband across state lines under the guise of legitimate business. Richard Vanderbilt was not just trying to steal my company. He was selling my legacy to international criminals to cover his own miserable debts. "And you need to authorize the transfer right now," Richard continued, pointing a long, bony finger at the documents. "The power of attorney forms are right there. All you have to do is sign your father's name, backdate it to last Wednesday before you took your little hiking trip. The notary stamp is already secured. My people took care of it. Sign the papers, Trey. Liquidate the fleet. We save the Vanderbilt estate, and you get to be the king of the castle." I sat in the cold metal folding chair inside the warehouse, gripping the edges so hard my knuckles turned pale. My breathing turned into ragged, painful gasps. The physical agony of my shattered ribs was screaming, but the mental torture was paralyzing. I was watching my son stand on the edge of a different kind of cliff. If Trey signed that paper, he was not just stealing my trucks. He was committing federal wire fraud. He was committing grand larceny. He was engaging in international money laundering. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not care about family drama. They do not care about country club prestige. If Trey put his pen on that dotted line, he was looking at 20 to 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His life would be over. Everything I had worked for, every sacrifice I had made to ensure he would never wear a prison jumpsuit, like so many brothers from our old neighborhood, would be completely destroyed. The fatherly instinct inside me, that deep, primal urge to protect my child from his own stupidity, flared up like a blinding fire. For a moment, the betrayal evaporated. For a moment, I did not see the 38-year-old man who had shoved me off a mountain. I saw a 4-year-old boy running toward me with scraped knees, needing his daddy to fix everything. I saw the teenager who crashed his first car and cried in my arms because he was so scared of going to jail. "I cannot let him do this," I gasped, my voice breaking in the dark warehouse. I reached out toward the control console. Kendrick had set up an emergency intercom link that connected directly to the hidden speakers in my study. All I had to do was press one glowing red button. My voice would echo through the study. I could stop him. I could scream at him to put the pen down. I could tell him the FBI would bury him. I could save him from throwing his entire existence into an incinerator. My hand hovered trembling over the red button. Then a hand clamped down over my wrist. It was not a gentle touch. It was a grip of absolute iron. I turned my head. Vivian was standing right beside me. The dim light of the monitors cast long, harsh shadows across her face. The blood from the mountain had dried on her cheek, looking like a battle scar. Her eyes were not the soft, loving eyes of the woman who had baked birthday cakes and organized Sunday dinners. They were the eyes of an apex predator watching a trapped animal. "Let me go, Vivian," I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper. "He does not know what he is doing. He is just a boy trying to impress a woman who hates him. If he signs that paper, the federal government will take him away forever. I have to stop him." Vivian did not let go of my wrist. In fact, she squeezed harder, driving the pain deep into my bones to ground me in reality. "Preston," she said, her voice dropping to a freezing, chilling register that commanded the entire room. "Look at the screen. Look at your son." I turned my eyes back to the monitor. Trey was holding a heavy, gold-plated pen. He was looking at the signature line. "He is a grown man. Preston?" Vivian continued her words, cutting through my panic like a scalpel. "You spent 40 years treating him like a fragile glass doll. You bought him his degrees. You bought his way out of trouble. You handed him a vice presidency he never earned. And what did he do with all that love? What did he do with all that protection?" She leaned closer to my ear. Her voice was steady, completely devoid of mercy. "He drove us to the mountains. He watched you look out over the gorge. And he pushed you. He threw you off a cliff, Preston. He left you to rot at the bottom of a river so he could impress a woman who thinks your grandfather is garbage. You are bleeding right now because of him." I closed my eyes. The image of the gravel crunching above us flashed in my mind, the sound of his heavy sigh, the sound of his voice saying nobody survives a drop like that. Vivian released my wrist. She placed her hand gently on my uninjured shoulder. "Do not save the man who tried to murder you," she whispered. "Let him sign his own death warrant." I opened my eyes and lowered my hand away from the intercom button. The burning desire to protect my son vanished, replaced by a cold, vast emptiness. Vivian was right. The boy I raised died on that mountain. The man standing in my study was just a thief waiting to be caught. On the screen, Richard Vanderbilt tapped the desk impatiently. "We do not have all night, Trey. Sign the document. The buyers are waiting for the confirmation. Once the routing numbers are locked in, the money will be wired. You will be free." Sloane stepped up behind Trey. She placed her hands on his shoulders, tracing her manicured fingernails along his collar. She leaned in and whispered something in his ear. A promise of power. A promise of acceptance. A promise of the white elite kingdom he so desperately craved. Trey closed his eyes for a microsecond. I watched his chest rise and fall as he took a deep breath. It was the absolute final moment of hesitation. It was the crossroads of his entire life. To his left was his father's legacy, his own blood and his freedom. To his right was an illusion built on lies, betrayal, and federal crimes. Trey opened his eyes. He tightened his grip on the gold-plated pen. He bent over my beautiful mahogany desk, and with smooth, practiced strokes he forged my name at the bottom of the liquidation transfer. He signed away 200 of my commercial freight trucks. He signed away $30 million. He signed away his freedom. The forgery was complete. The federal crime was officially committed. Richard Vanderbilt let out a massive breath of relief. He snatched the papers off the desk with greedy, trembling hands and shoved them back into his leather briefcase. "Excellent," Richard said, a triumphant smile spreading across his pale face. "I will authorize the transfer with the overseas syndicate right now. The money will be moving by tomorrow morning." Sloane kissed Trey on the cheek. Her smile was radiant, victorious, and completely devoid of any genuine affection. "You did it, honey," she praised him softly. "You finally took control." I watched the three of them celebrate their successful theft in the middle of my study. They thought they had outsmarted the old truck driver. They thought they had won the war before the bodies were even cold. They had no idea that they had just locked themselves inside a burning building and handed me the only key to the exit. In the shadows of the warehouse, Kendrick stepped forward. His massive arms hung by his sides, ready for action. He looked at the monitor, then he looked down at me sitting in the folding chair. The silence was heavy with anticipation. "What is our move, boss?" Kendrick asked, his low, gravelly voice steady and waiting for the command. I did not flinch. The pain in my chest was gone, replaced by a dark, absolute resolve. I stared at the screen, watching my son pour another glass of my expensive bourbon to celebrate his newly committed felonies. My eyes went completely dead. I was no longer a father. I was the architect of their destruction. "We let them sell my trucks," I replied. I leaned back in the cold metal chair, ignoring the sharp stab of my fractured ribs against the splint Vivian had fashioned. The decision was made. The Rubicon was crossed. There was a strange, profound peace that comes when you finally accept that a loved one is a lost cause. For decades, I had carried the massive weight of Trey's future on my shoulders. I had absorbed his failures and shielded him from the harsh consequences of the real world. Tonight, the burden was lifted. I was setting him free to face the absolute brutal reality of his own greed. Vivian stood silently beside me, her posture rigid, her eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the monitors. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. There is no joy in watching a child you birthed and raised destroy themselves, but there is a necessary grim satisfaction in knowing you are no longer the victim. We had transitioned from prey to predators in the span of a few excruciating hours. On the screen, Richard Vanderbilt was already dialing his encrypted phone, stepping out of my study and pacing the grand hallway. The urgency in his steps was palpable. He was a desperate man sealing a desperate deal with dangerous people. Sloane poured herself another drink, her posture relaxed, her eyes sweeping over the room as if she were mentally cataloging the furniture to be sold next. Trey simply stood by the desk, staring at the empty space where the forged documents had been just moments before. He looked numb, like a man who had just severed the final tether to his own soul. Kendrick nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of my command. He turned toward the secondary computer terminals set up along the warehouse wall. He began typing rapidly, pulling up the encrypted tracking software that monitored the logistics company's master banking portals. If they are selling 200 trucks to an overseas syndicate, the funds are going to have to route through the central holding accounts before Vanderbilt can divert them to his real estate firm, Kendrick stated, his eyes scanning the cascading lines of green code. Yes, Vivian said, stepping away from me and moving toward the keyboards. And that is exactly where we will be waiting for them. I remained in my chair, staring at the frozen image of my son on the main monitor. The game was no longer about survival. It was about absolute total annihilation. The vultures had gathered, they had feasted on what they thought was my corpse, and now they were going to choke on the bones. We let them sell my trucks, I repeated softly into the cold air of the warehouse. Let them count the money they think they have stolen. Let them feel the victory. Because when the federal trap snaps shut, I want them to lose everything. 2 weeks dragged by in the cold shadows of the industrial warehouse. For 14 days, I sat in that metal folding chair watching the high-definition monitors while my shattered ribs slowly knit themselves back together. 14 days of watching the world move on without Preston Cole. The local news channels covered our disappearance around the clock. The police search teams had scoured the base of the mountain and dragged the river gorge for miles. They found pieces of Vivian's torn coat that we had deliberately left snagged on the rocks near the raging water. By the 10th day, the local sheriff held a press conference declaring that the search and rescue mission was officially transitioning into a recovery operation. He looked into the cameras and told the city of Atlanta that given the harsh currents and the steep drop, there was zero chance of survival. Our bodies were presumed washed away into the deep reservoirs downriver. We were officially ghosts, and as ghosts we had front-row tickets to our own funeral. The memorial service was a spectacle of absolute hypocrisy. Trey and Sloane did not spare a single expense. Why would they? They were paying for it with my money. Through the encrypted feed, Vivian had tapped into the church security cameras and the live stream being broadcast for the logistics company employees. The cathedral in downtown Atlanta was packed to the rafters. Hundreds of my drivers, warehouse managers, and business partners filled the pews wearing their Sunday best out of genuine respect for the man who signed their paychecks. But the front row was a totally different story. The front row was a nest of vipers wearing $1,000 black suits and designer mourning veils. Sloane walked up to the podium. She wore a tailored black dress that looked like it belonged on a fashion runway rather than at a pulpit. She adjusted the microphone and looked out over the crowd. She took a deep, trembling breath. If I did not know the absolute truth, I would have believed her performance. She was a master manipulator. Preston and Vivian Cole were not just my in-laws. She began, her voice breaking with a perfectly calculated sorrow. They were the very foundation of this family. They welcomed me with open arms. They taught me the true meaning of resilience and generosity. Atlanta has lost a titan of industry today, but I have lost a second mother and father. I sat in the warehouse staring at the screen. I felt no anger anymore. The anger had burned itself out days ago, leaving nothing but a vast, freezing wasteland inside my chest. This was the same woman who threw my grandfather's photograph in the garbage bag. This was the woman who complained about my ghetto aesthetic. Now she was dabbing at the corner of her eye with a silk handkerchief, soaking up the sympathy of hundreds of hardworking people. Then the camera cut to Trey. My son was sitting in the front pew, his head bowed. He reached up and wiped a tear from his cheek. He looked like a devastated child. He looked like a man whose world had just been violently ripped apart. Looking at his fake tears, a memory hit me with the force of a freight train. It was 20 years ago. Trey was getting ready to start his freshman year at a prestigious university. He needed a formal suit for a business fraternity mixer. At the time, my freight company was barely surviving a brutal recession. We were drowning in equipment loans. I was working 80-hour weeks, breathing in toxic diesel fumes, sleeping on a greasy mattress in the back office just to keep the lights on. But when my boy told me he needed a suit, I did not hesitate. I took the last $600 I had to my name and I took him to a high-end tailor downtown. I remember standing in that shop wearing my dirty work boots while the tailor measured him. I remember Trey looking at himself in the three-way mirror, standing tall and proud in that charcoal gray wool. I told him that day that a black man in this world has to work twice as hard to get half the respect, but as long as he had my blood in his veins, he would never walk into a room feeling inferior. I gave him my last dollar so he could feel like a king, and he used his royal hands to push me off a cliff. Sitting in the warehouse, watching him wipe away a fake tear for the cameras, I reached deep inside my soul, and I took that memory of the boy in the mirror, and I strangled it. I killed the last ounce of fatherly love I had left. I buried it right next to the empty casket sitting in that cathedral. The man on the screen was not my son. He was just a thief wearing a suit I paid for. The service ended, and the live stream transitioned to the private reception back at our mansion. The cameras Vivian had hidden in our estate picked up the feed immediately. The house was full of Atlanta elite drinking my wine and eating catered food. But my eyes were not on the crowd. My eyes were on Sloane. She slipped away from the crowded dining room and walked into the grand hallway, checking over her shoulder to make sure nobody was following her. She stepped out onto the side balcony, pulling a cheap plastic burner phone from her designer clutch. She dialed a number and pressed the phone to her ear. Vivian quickly isolated the audio feed from the balcony microphone, boosting the gain so we could hear every word clearly. "The funeral is done," Sloane said, her voice completely devoid of the sorrow she had just displayed at the church. "It went perfectly. My father sent the forged documents over to your people this morning. Tell the Russian buyers they can wire the $30 million for the fleet tomorrow morning. Trey will confirm the transfer on his end." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. A cold, arrogant smile spread across her pale face. "Yes, I know," she replied. "Once the money hits the holding account, we transfer it immediately to my father's firm. We save the estate, and we wash our hands of this entire logistics nightmare. Just make sure the wire goes through by 9 in the morning." Sloane hung up the burner phone and slipped it back into her purse. She took a deep breath, smoothed the front of her black dress, and walked back inside to play the grieving widow. In the warehouse, I slowly turned my head to look at Vivian. She was already moving. She did not say a word. She just pulled up a heavy metal chair and sat down in front of her high-powered laptop. Most people looked at my wife and saw a quiet, elegant woman who loved hosting charity dinners. They thought I was the sole brain behind Cole Logistics. They were completely wrong. When we started the company with one single truck, Vivian was the one balancing the books on our kitchen table. As the company grew to 50 trucks, then 200 trucks, Vivian was the one who built the entire digital infrastructure from the ground up. She knew the back-end routing codes better than the highly paid corporate engineers. She knew every firewall, every security bypass, and every hidden backdoor in the master banking portal. She was not just a housewife. She was the ghost in the machine. Vivian opened her laptop and her fingers began flying across the keyboard with blinding speed. Lines of green code reflected in her dark eyes. Kendrick stepped up behind her, his massive arms crossed over his chest, watching the screen intently. "What is the play?" Miss Vivian Kendrick asked, his deep voice rumbling in the quiet space. "Are we locking them out of the master account to block the sale?" Vivian shook her head, her eyes locked on the screen. "If we just block the transaction, Richard Vanderbilt will find another way. He will call the bank claiming technical difficulties. He will use the forged power of attorney to bypass the block. We cannot just stop the money. We have to turn the money into a weapon." I leaned forward, wincing slightly as my ribs shifted. "What are you doing, Vivian?" I asked. She typed another sequence of commands, bypassing the corporate firewall with a master override code only she possessed. The Russians are going to wire $30 million in offshore untraceable funds to our corporate holding account, she explained, her voice cold and methodical. Trey and Sloan expect that money to sit there for a few hours, just long enough for Trey to manually route it into the Vanderbilt real estate accounts. She hit a key and a massive banking interface popped up on the monitor. I am not going to stop the Russians from sending the money, Vivian continued. I am going to let them send it. But I am going into our system, and I am rewriting the destination routing numbers for our master account. She looked up at me, and a chilling smile touched the corners of her mouth. Last year, when we set up our philanthropic initiatives, you created a federal blind trust monitored directly by the Internal Revenue Service. It is a locked account meant for charitable endowments. Any large, unverified sum of money that hits that specific federal account automatically triggers a total government freeze. It alerts the IRS and the Department of Homeland Security simultaneously. Kendrick let out a low whistle, stepping closer to the screen. Miss Vivian, he said, his voice laced with sudden tension. If you reroute $30 million of dirty cartel money into a locked federal trust fund, that money is gone forever. The government will seize it pending investigation. The Russians will lose $30 million in a split second. Exactly, Vivian said, her fingers hovering over the enter key. Kendrick looked at me, his expression deadly serious. Boss, you know who these buyers are. They are not local street thugs. They are a ruthless overseas syndicate. They do not file lawsuits when their money goes missing. They send men with suppressed weapons. If their money vanishes into a federal trap, they are going to demand answers. I looked at Kendrick. Then I looked at the monitor showing the live feed of my home. I watched Trey walking through my living room, shaking hands and accepting condolences from people he had been lying to all day. He looked so comfortable in his stolen kingdom. He thought he had outsmarted the world. That is exactly the point, Kendrick. I said, my voice completely stripped of mercy. When $30 million of dirty money gets seized by the federal government, the Russians are not going to call the police. They are not going to call their lawyers. They are going to look at the name on the forged contract. I looked at Vivian and gave her a single slow nod. They are going to call Trey, I said. And he is going to have to explain to a cartel how he lost their money. Let the wolves eat the jackals. Vivian did not hesitate. She slammed her finger down on the enter key. The screen flashed green, confirming the routing numbers had been successfully altered and locked behind her master encryption. The trap was set. The bomb was armed and ticking. All we had to do now was sit back in the dark and wait for the sun to rise. Because tomorrow morning my son was going to wake up thinking he was a multi-millionaire, but by noon he was going to find out he was a dead man walking. The sun rose over Atlanta, but inside the warehouse it remained a cold, dark tomb. Vivian, Kendrick, and I sat in silence, staring at the wall of glowing monitors. We had not slept. We had barely spoken. We were just waiting for the trap to spring shut. The digital clock on the bottom corner of the screen slowly ticked toward 9 in the morning. That was the agreed-upon time. The time my son was scheduled to sell his soul and my legacy to international criminals. Right on schedule, the security cameras at the main gate of my estate triggered an alert. 2 massive black SUVs with heavily tinted windows rolled up to the wrought iron gates. Trey had already programmed the security system to let them right in. The heavy metal gates swung open smoothly and the vehicles crept up the long winding driveway like hearses arriving for a burial. I leaned forward in my folding chair, my eyes locked on the screen. The pain in my crushed ribs was completely gone, replaced by a pure, burning adrenaline. 4 men stepped out of the vehicles. They did not look like logistics executives. They did not look like bankers or corporate investors. They wore expensive dark suits, but the tailoring could not hide the heavy muscular builds underneath. They moved with the cold, calculated efficiency of men who were used to violence. These were fixers, cleaners for a shadow syndicate that moved blood money across the globe, the kind of men who made people disappear without a trace. Trey opened the heavy oak front doors of my home to greet them. Seeing him standing there made my stomach churn with a sickening mix of disgust and pity. My son was wearing one of my custom-tailored navy blue suits. The sleeves were a fraction too long and the shoulders did not fit him quite right. He looked like a little boy playing dress-up in his father's closet. He plastered a wide, arrogant smile across his face, trying to project dominance. He extended his hand to the lead buyer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick gray beard and eyes like dead winter ice. "Welcome, gentlemen," Trey said, his voice booming through the hidden microphones. "Right this way. Let us get down to business." The lead buyer did not shake Trey's hand. He simply stared at it for a second before pushing past my son and walking directly into the grand foyer. His 3 muscle men followed silently. Trey swallowed hard, trying to hide his embarrassment. He quickly recovered his fake swagger and led them into my private master study. Sloane was already waiting for them inside. She stood next to my mahogany desk wearing a pristine white designer dress, her arms crossed over her chest. She lifted her chin, looking at the dangerous men with a supreme, arrogant confidence. She really believed that her bankrupt Vanderbilt pedigree made her untouchable. She thought her white elite status was an invisible shield that would protect her from the absolute monsters standing in my study. She had no idea that to these men her family name meant absolutely nothing. To them, she was just another obstacle in a transaction. Trey walked around the heavy wooden desk and sat down in my leather executive chair. He leaned back, kicking one leg over the other, trying to look relaxed. He reached into the top drawer and pulled out a cedar humidor. He opened it and offered it to the lead buyer. "Cuban cigars," Trey offered, flashing another fake smile. "Imported them myself. We can enjoy a smoke while the funds clear." The lead buyer stared at the cigars. He did not smile. He did not blink. His thick accent cut through the room like a rusted blade. "We are not here to smoke, little man," he said, his voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal menace. "We are here for the titles to the 200 transport vehicles. We have a shipping schedule to maintain, and my employers do not like delays. Put the documents on the desk." Trey slowly lowered the humidor, his fake mafia boss persona crumbling instantly under the crushing weight of the Russian's stare. He cleared his throat, trying to salvage his dignity. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders. Inside those folders were the forged titles to 200 of my commercial semi-trucks, the very trucks I had bought with decades of sweat and sacrifice. He slid the folders across the polished mahogany wood. The lead buyer did not touch them. He nodded to one of his men. The man stepped forward, opened the folders, and began meticulously inspecting the forged signatures and the fake notary stamps. Vivian had trained me well over the years to spot a bad deal. Watching these men, I knew they were professionals. They checked the vehicle identification numbers against a digital manifest on a small device. After 5 agonizing minutes, the man nodded to his boss. "The paperwork appears in order." The lead buyer reached inside his tailored jacket. Trey flinched visibly, thinking the man was reaching for a weapon. But the Russian simply pulled out a sleek, encrypted digital tablet. He placed it on the desk. "You provided the routing numbers for the offshore corporate holding account," he stated, looking dead at my son. "Yes," Trey answered, his voice trembling slightly. "The account is secure and ready to receive the transfer. Once the 30 million clears the system, the trucks are yours." Sloane stepped closer to the desk, her eyes locked on the digital tablet with greedy, desperate anticipation. This was her salvation. This was the dirty money that was going to save her precious Vanderbilt estate and secure her luxurious lifestyle. She looked at Trey and gave him a tiny, victorious smirk. She actually believed they had won. She believed they had successfully murdered us, stolen my empire, and walked away completely clean. The lead Russian typed a long sequence of access codes into his encrypted tablet. The silence in my study was absolute. In the warehouse, Vivian, Kendrick, and I held our collective breath. I watched the Russian's thick finger hover over the screen. Then he pressed the transfer button. "Done," the Russian said, plainly setting the tablet face down on the desk. $30 million has been wired. It will hit your holding account in less than 10 minutes. Trey let out a massive, heavy breath of relief. He actually slumped back in my leather chair, wiping a layer of sweat from his forehead. He looked at Sloane, and they shared a silent, triumphant glance. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they were the new king and queen of Atlanta. They had no idea that they were currently sitting inside a burning cage. "We wait here until the confirmation comes through," the Russian said, crossing his massive arms. "Of course," Trey replied, his confidence returning now that he thought the money was secure. "Take your time. We have all morning." The next 10 minutes were the longest 10 minutes of my entire life. I watched the digital clock on our monitor tick away the seconds. Every single second was a countdown to absolute destruction. Trey tried to make small talk, but the Russians completely ignored him. They stood around my study like stone gargoyles, waiting for the final confirmation from their syndicate bosses. Sloane paced near the window, practically vibrating with excitement. In the warehouse, Vivian leaned closer to her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, tracking the massive financial wire through the global banking network. "It is moving," she whispered, her eyes reflecting the scrolling green code. "The cartel bank just authorized the release. The 30 million is currently routing through the offshore servers. It is hitting the domestic gateway now." Kendrick stepped up right beside her, his massive frame tense and ready. "Is it going to divert Miss Vivian?" he asked, his deep voice barely above a whisper. Vivian did not answer immediately. She watched the screen with the focus of a sniper. "The funds are approaching the primary corporate holding account," she narrated, cold and precise. "They are hitting the firewall, and the diversion protocol is active." She hit a single key. The screen flashed a bright warning red. "Got them," Vivian said, a chilling smile forming on her lips. "The $30 million just bounced off our corporate account and dropped straight into the locked federal blind trust. The Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Homeland Security just received an automated alert for a massive, unverified international wire transfer. The money is frozen. It is locked in a federal vault. The cartel just lost $30 million in a fraction of a second." I turned my eyes back to the live feed of my study. The 10 minutes had passed. Suddenly, the silence in the room was shattered by a sharp, buzzing sound. The lead buyer's encrypted cell phone was ringing inside his jacket pocket. Trey smiled broadly. "Ah, that must be your people calling to confirm the transaction is complete," he said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on my desk. "A pleasure doing business with you, gentlemen." The Russian did not smile. He pulled the phone from his pocket and pressed it to his ear. He spoke rapidly in a foreign language, his tone low and harsh. I watched his face closely. It took exactly 4 seconds for his expression to change. The cold, businesslike demeanor vanished completely. The blood seemed to drain from his face, replacing his stoic calm with an absolute murderous rage. His eyes darkened, turning into black, bottomless pits. The muscles in his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth would shatter. He did not say goodbye. He just lowered the phone and slowly slid it back into his pocket. The atmosphere in the study instantly plummeted to freezing. The 3 muscle men behind him shifted their stances, their hands moving instinctively toward the inside of their jackets. Trey noticed the shift. His fake, confident smile faltered. His eyes darted nervously between the massive men. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice cracking pathetically. "Did the wire transfer clear?" Sloane stopped pacing. She turned around, sensing the sudden lethal danger in the room. "What is going on?" she demanded, her arrogant tone slipping into genuine panic. "My father's bank is waiting for the routing confirmation." The lead buyer did not look at Sloane. He kept his dead, furious eyes locked entirely on my son. He took one slow, deliberate step toward my mahogany desk. Trey pushed his chair back, the leather squeaking loudly in the quiet room. He raised his hands defensively. "Look, if there is a delay with the offshore servers, we can just wait a few more minutes. Sometimes these large sums take a moment to process through the clearinghouse." The Russian reached inside his tailored jacket. He did not pull out a pen. He did not pull out a digital tablet. He pulled out a heavy black suppressed pistol. Sloane let out a blood-curdling scream, backing away until she hit the bookshelf. Trey froze, completely paralyzed by absolute terror. He stared at the weapon in shock, his mouth opening and closing without making a single sound. The Russian did not point the gun at Trey, not yet. He slowly, deliberately placed the heavy weapon right in the center of my polished mahogany desk. The metal clunked loudly against the wood. He leaned over the desk, placing his massive hands flat on the surface, bringing his face mere inches from my trembling son. The money bounced into a locked federal account. The Russian whispered, his thick accent dripping with lethal intent. "My employers just triggered a government freeze. We are now exposed to a federal investigation." He tilted his head, his dead eyes staring straight through Trey's soul. "Where is our cash, little boy?" The heavy black pistol sat on my mahogany desk like a death sentence. Trey stared at the weapon. His mouth hung open. The arrogant smirk he wore just a minute ago was completely gone. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. He sounded like a choking animal. I watched the live feed from the dark warehouse, feeling the cold metal of my folding chair against my back. Vivian stood beside me, her eyes locked on the screen without a single ounce of mercy. Trey scrambled backward, his chair rolling and hitting the bookshelf. He lunged for his laptop, his hands shaking so violently he knocked over a crystal glass. The glass shattered on the floor, but nobody moved. Trey hammered his fingers against the keyboard, trying to log into the master holding account. The Russian fixer did not blink. He just watched my son sweat. I could almost smell the fear radiating through the monitors. Trey opened the transaction logs. I saw his eyes widen in absolute horror as he read the destination code. He realized the $30 million did not go to the offshore accounts. It bounced straight into a locked federal blind trust monitored by the Internal Revenue Service. Sloane stepped forward. She smoothed her pristine white designer dress, trying to project the authority of her aristocratic bloodline. She actually believed her family name meant something to these men. She looked at the lead buyer with a forced, haughty expression. "Listen to me," she said, her voice trembling but trying to sound commanding. "I am Sloane Vanderbilt. My family owns half the commercial real estate in this city. There has obviously been a banking error. My father has immense influence with the local authorities. We will make a phone call and have the funds released to you immediately." The Russian slowly turned his head to look at her. He did not look impressed. He looked like a wolf studying a very small and very stupid sheep. "Your father is a bankrupt fraud," the Russian stated, his thick accent cutting through her arrogance like a machete. "He owes $20 million to domestic banks, and now his husband owes $30 million to my employers." The Russian took one heavy step toward Sloane. She instantly shrank back, hitting the edge of my desk. "Do not speak to me about influence, little girl," he whispered. "My employers just triggered a federal alert because of your amateur mistakes. We are now exposed to the federal government." The Russian turned his attention back to Trey. He reached across the mahogany desk. He grabbed my son by the collar of his expensive tailored suit. He lifted Trey halfway out of the leather chair, pulling him dangerously close to the heavy suppressed pistol. Trey whimpered. It was a pathetic broken sound. He looked like a terrified little boy. The Russian leaned in, his voice dropping to a lethal calm register. "You have exactly 48 hours, he said. 48 hours to unfreeze that money and route it to the correct offshore accounts. If that money does not clear by this time on Friday, we are going to come back to this house. We will kill you. We will kill your beautiful wife. And then we will find your bankrupt father-in-law and we will kill him too." The Russian let go of Trey. My son collapsed back into the chair, gasping for air. The fixer picked up the heavy pistol and slid it smoothly back inside his tailored jacket. He did not say another word. He simply turned and walked out of the study. His 3 massive muscle men followed him in perfect silence. We watched the security cameras as they walked out the front doors, got into their black vehicles, and drove down the long driveway. The heavy wrought iron gates closed behind them, sealing my son inside a nightmare of his own making. The moment the front doors clicked shut, the false reality Trey and Sloane had built completely shattered. The silence in the study was suffocating. Trey leaned forward over my beautiful mahogany desk. His face was pale gray. He grabbed his stomach and began to heave. He stumbled out of the chair, fell to his knees, and threw up violently all over my antique Persian rug. He coughed and spit, shivering on the floor like a beaten dog. I watched my flesh and blood crawl in his own vomit, and I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sorrow, just the cold satisfaction of a trap snapping shut. I built a $50 million empire with my bare hands. I faced down corrupt politicians, union bosses, and ruthless competitors. I took beatings, and I kept walking. And there was my son, the boy who thought he was a king, throwing up on a rug because he finally met real consequences. Sloane did not bend down to help her husband. She did not comfort the man who had just thrown his parents off a mountain to secure her future. She looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She backed away, holding her expensive dress so it would not touch the mess on the floor. "Get up!" she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "Get up, you pathetic loser! You were supposed to handle a simple transaction. You told me the logistics company was yours. You told me your father left the access codes in the master safe. How did the money bounce into a federal account?" Trey wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his expensive suit. He dragged himself up, leaning against the edge of the desk. "I do not know," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "The routing numbers were correct. I copied them exactly from the holding account ledger. Someone must have triggered a security protocol from the inside. The bank must have flagged the sheer volume of the wire." Sloane paced the room, her perfect aristocratic mask entirely gone. She looked like a trapped rat. "I do not care about security protocols," she yelled, pointing a shaking finger at his face. "The cartel just threatened to murder my father. They threatened to murder me. We have 48 hours, Trey. 48 hours before ruthless killers come back to this estate and execute us. You need to call the bank. You need to call the federal regulators. Fix this right now." In the dark warehouse, Vivian pulled her metal folding chair closer to the server console. The blue light from the monitors cast a cold glow across her face. She cracked her knuckles. Her eyes were locked on the secondary screen displaying the back end of the corporate banking portal. "They are panicking, Preston," she whispered, her voice steady and calculating. "He is trying to log back into the mainframe. He thinks he can just call a bank manager and reverse a federal freeze. He really is that arrogant." On the main monitor, Trey collapsed back into my leather chair. He pushed his laptop closer, avoiding the mess on the floor. His fingers hammered the keyboard. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead as he navigated the corporate security layers. He pulled up the master holding account, trying to access the administrative override protocols. He thought he had the highest level of clearance. He thought since I was dead at the bottom of a river gorge, he owned the entire digital kingdom. He was frantically trying to input his executive vice president credentials to authorize a reversal of the federal transfer. Kendrick stood behind Vivian, watching her screen. "Lock him out, Miss Vivian," Kendrick said, his low, gravelly voice vibrating in the quiet warehouse. "Let him know he is not in charge." Vivian smiled a thin, ruthless smile. "I am not just going to lock him out, Kendrick," she replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I am going to let him know exactly whose throne he is trying to steal." Vivian bypassed Trey's executive login using her master creator encryption. She intercepted his digital request right as he hit the enter key. On the live feed, we watched Trey stare at his laptop screen. He stopped typing. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes widening in sheer disbelief. The banking portal on his screen went completely black. Then a single line of bright red text appeared dead in the center of his monitor. Vivian typed the words remotely from our hidden warehouse, sending the message directly to his screen. "Invalid authorization. Account holder Preston Cole." Trey read the words. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. He stopped breathing. He slowly lifted his head and looked around my empty study. He looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling. He looked straight into the camera hidden inside the crystal chandelier. He could not see us, but he knew. The federal freeze was not a banking error. The altered routing numbers were not an accident. Someone inside the system had intentionally sabotaged the sale, and that someone was using his dead father's name. The ultimate realization hit him like a physical blow. He threw us off a mountain, but the ghost of Preston Cole was still running the company. The red letters on the computer screen burned into my son's eyes. Invalid authorization. Account holder. Preston Cole. Trey stumbled backward away from my mahogany desk as if the laptop itself had caught fire. He bumped into the heavy wooden bookshelf and just stood there panting like a hunted animal. The ghost of his father was in the machine. He knew it. The cartel death sentence was ticking down, and the $30 million was locked inside a federal vault. Trey dragged himself out of my study and staggered into the grand living room. Sloan followed close behind him. The massive living room with its vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers suddenly looked like a very expensive prison cell. The silence between them was toxic. The polished illusion of their high society marriage was cracking wide open right in front of our hidden cameras. In the warehouse, Vivian leaned closer to the monitor. Her face was a mask of cold concentration. Kendrick stood behind us, his massive arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable explosion. When rats are trapped in a burning cage, they do not comfort each other. They eat each other to survive. And the fire in my mansion was getting incredibly hot. Sloan paced back and forth across the imported rugs. Her white designer dress was impeccable, but her face was twisted into an ugly mask of sheer panic. She grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the side table and hurled it against the stone fireplace. The crystal shattered into 1,000 pieces, echoing loudly through the microphones. "Are you out of your mind?" Sloan screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Call the bank, Trey. Call the legal department right now. You are the executive vice president. Tell them it was a routing error. Tell them your father set up a failsafe before he died and you need the master override. We have 48 hours before those Russian monsters come back here and murder us." Trey stood in the middle of the living room looking completely hollowed out. He shook his head slowly, his hands trembling at his sides. "I cannot call the bank, Sloan," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Did you not see the message on the screen? The account is locked under my father's credentials. Someone inside the federal system knows the transfer was fraudulent. If I call the bank and try to claim $30 million of dirty cartel cash, they will trace the forged power of attorney directly to me. I will go to federal prison." "Federal prison?" Sloan laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound that lacked any trace of sanity. "You think the cartel cares about federal prison, Trey? You think those men who just put a gun on your father's desk care about white-collar crime? They're going to put bullets in our heads. My father's real estate empire is collapsing by Monday, and now we owe blood money to an international syndicate because you could not handle one simple wire transfer. Trey finally snapped. The pressure of the murder, the forgery, and the cartel death threat broke whatever fragile spine he had left. He stepped toward her, his fists clenched. "This is your fault," he yelled, his voice bouncing off the marble floors. "You and your bankrupt father orchestrated this entire nightmare. You told me the trust fund was too slow. You told me we needed liquid cash immediately. I pushed my own parents off a mountain for you, Sloan. I committed murder so you could keep your country club memberships and your designer clothes. I destroyed my own soul to save your miserable family." The silence that followed his confession was absolute. In the warehouse, Vivian slowly closed her eyes, absorbing the brutal spoken confirmation of our attempted murder. Hearing it out loud from his own mouth erased any lingering ghost of a doubt. On the screen, Sloan stopped pacing. She turned to look at my son. The fake affection, the manufactured smiles, the polite society grace, everything vanished completely. What remained was the cold, arrogant reality of a woman who viewed my son as nothing more than a disposable tool. "You did it for me," Sloan asked, her voice dropping into a vicious, mocking whisper. "You did not do it for me, Trey. You did it because you are a pathetic, weak man who desperately wanted to belong in my world. You wanted the Vanderbilt name to wash off the stench of your background. You wanted to sit at the country club and pretend you were not just the son of a sweaty mechanic." Trey froze. The blood drained entirely from his face. He stared at his wife as if he was seeing her for the very first time. Sloan took a step closer, her eyes blazing with pure, unadulterated contempt. The mask slipped completely off her face. "I should not have expected a truck driver's ghetto son to handle a simple transaction." She screamed, the vicious words slicing through the room like a razor blade. "You had a $50 million empire handed to you on a silver platter, and you could not even forge a single document properly. You are nothing but a cheap imitation of a businessman. You are just as useless as your father." The racial and class hatred dripping from her words hit the room with the force of an explosion. She did not just insult his competence. She insulted his blood. She insulted his race. She insulted the decades of agonizing labor it took to build our family name from the dirt of South Atlanta. Trey stood completely paralyzed. His shoulders slumped, his breathing stopped. I watched my son's entire universe collapse right in front of him. He looked at the woman he had killed for. He realized in that agonizing, terrifying second that she had never loved him. She had never respected him. She despised his race. She despised his background. She viewed him as a disposable street rat, a convenient idiot who could be manipulated into doing the dirty work while her aristocratic family kept their hands clean. He threw his mother and father off a cliff for a woman who thought he was garbage. He traded his legacy, his heritage, and his freedom for a seat at a table where he was nothing but a servant. The total devastation on his face was absolute. He had sold his soul to the devil, and the devil was currently screaming at him in his own living room. In the warehouse, Kendrick let out a low, dangerous growl. He gripped the back of Vivian's metal chair, his massive knuckles turning white. Vivian did not blink. She stared at Sloane's face on the monitor, her expression carved from solid ice. "Let him hear it," Vivian whispered softly. "Let him hear exactly what his betrayal bought him. Let the poison sink all the way to his bones." Trey opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was completely broken. He took a staggering step backward, bumping into the leather sofa. He looked like a man who had just realized he was already dead. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of a cell phone pierced the toxic silence in the living room. Sloane jumped. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her phone. She looked at the caller identification, and her face tightened. "It is my father," she muttered, her tone shifting back to panicked desperation. She answered the phone and put it on speaker, pressing it to her ear. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking, "the cartel just left. The money bounced into a federal trust. The system locked Trey out. They gave us 48 hours before they come back to kill us." Richard Vanderbilt's voice echoed through the hidden microphones. His tone was breathless, ragged, and completely terrified. "I know, Sloane." Richard gasped through the speaker. "The syndicate bosses just called my private line. They threatened to burn down my corporate office with me inside it. The banking route is completely compromised. We cannot use digital transfers anymore. The federal government is watching that account. We need untraceable liquid cash, and we need it by tomorrow night." Untraceable cash. Sloane cried out, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair. Dad, how are we supposed to raise $30 million in physical assets in 48 hours? Our properties are mortgaged to the hilt. We have absolutely nothing left to sell. Richard Vanderbilt paused. I could hear his heavy, panicked breathing through the phone speaker. He was a cornered rat looking for any possible escape route. We do not have anything to sell, Richard said, his voice dropping to a dark, sinister register. But Preston Cole does. Trey lifted his head slowly, staring at the phone in Sloane's hand. Listen to me carefully, Richard commanded, his voice speeding up with frantic energy. The logistics fleet is locked in the digital system, but the physical assets inside that estate are not. Preston Cole has a massive collection of vintage classic cars sitting in his private garage. He has millions of dollars in original artwork hanging on those walls. Vivian has a wall safe filled with undocumented diamond jewelry. We have one option left to raise the cartel money and save our lives. Sloane held the phone tighter, her eyes widening as the desperate plan took shape in her mind. What are you saying, Dad? She asked. I am saying we host a memorial charity auction at the estate tomorrow night, Richard declared, the sheer desperation bleeding through every word. We invite the wealthiest buyers in the Atlanta underground. We sell Preston's classic car collection. We sell the art. We sell the jewelry. We disguise it as a high society tribute to the Cole family legacy, but we demand cash only. Quick, untraceable cash. It is the only way to appease the cartel before the 48-hour deadline expires. Set up the ballroom, Sloane. Call the caterers. Call the private buyers. We are liquidating the estate tomorrow. The phone call ended. Sloane lowered the device, looking around my living room, not as a home, but as a pawn shop. Trey just sat on the edge of the sofa, his head buried in his hands, completely defeated by the nightmare closing in around him. In the warehouse, I slowly stood up from my metal folding chair. The pain in my ribs was a distant memory. My blood was roaring. They wanted to sell my classic cars. They wanted to sell my wife's diamonds to save their miserable lives. I looked at Kendrick. Get the secure phone, Kendrick, I said, my voice cold and hard as steel. It is time to make a phone call to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are going to a charity auction. The sun barely cleared the Atlanta skyline before the invasion of my estate began. Sitting in the cold, dim light of the warehouse, I watched the security monitors as a fleet of white catering vans and luxury event rental trucks rolled through my wrought iron gates. The heavy tires chewed up the pristine gravel driveway I had paid a small fortune to maintain. Dozens of workers in matching uniforms swarmed the grounds, carrying massive tents, floral arrangements, and folding chairs. They were moving with a frantic, chaotic energy driven by the shrill, panicked commands of my daughter-in-law. Sloane stood on the front steps of the mansion, clutching a clipboard and holding a phone to her ear. She was coordinating the most desperate and pathetic garage sale in the history of high society. They called it a memorial charity gala, a beautiful, elegant tribute to the legacy of Preston and Vivian Cole. But underneath the expensive white roses and the rented crystal champagne flutes, it was nothing but a frantic, blood-soaked liquidation. Trey wandered through the grand foyer, looking like a hollow shell of a human being. He wore wrinkled clothes, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting nervously toward the front gate every time a new vehicle arrived. He was terrified. He knew the clock was ticking down. The Russian cartel fixers had given them exactly 48 hours to replace the $30 million that bounced into the federal trust fund. Every second that ticked by brought them closer to their own executions. He bumped into a worker carrying a tray of appetizers and barely mumbled an apology. The boy I raised to be strong and proud was reduced to a trembling coward, jumping at shadows in his own stolen house. Sloane walked up to him and shoved a guest list into his chest, her face twisted with vicious urgency. She pointed toward the ballroom, barking orders at him to get the auction catalog finalized. There was no love left between them. The pressure of impending death had burned away their fake aristocratic marriage, leaving only raw, desperate survival. In the warehouse, Vivian sat perfectly still in her metal folding chair watching the screens. I saw her jaw tighten as the camera feed shifted to our master bedroom. Two men wearing white fabric gloves walked into her private sanctuary. They carried heavy padded velvet cases. Sloane followed them inside, pointing toward the wall safe we kept hidden behind an oil painting. Trey had supplied the access code. The men opened the safe and began pulling out decades of our lives. They pulled out the diamond tennis bracelet I bought Vivian for our 20th anniversary. They pulled out the pearl necklace passed down from her grandmother. They placed every piece of our history into those velvet cases, treating my wife and her memories like cheap pawnshop collateral. They were going to sell her legacy to the highest bidder in the Atlanta underground tonight just to save themselves from the cartel. I watched Vivian carefully catalog every stolen item in her mind, her eyes cold and unblinking. She did not shed a tear. She was long past crying. The humiliation did not stop in the bedroom. The cameras in the main hallway showed an appraisal team pulling down the original artwork I had collected over 40 years. Paintings by prominent African-American artists and pieces that documented our culture and our struggles were unceremoniously yanked off the walls and wrapped in bubble wrap. Sloan directed the team with cold efficiency, checking items off her clipboard. She was sanitizing the house of our existence and pricing it for quick, untraceable cash. The Atlanta elite would arrive tonight, drinking my top-shelf wine, bidding on my stolen property, believing they were contributing to a noble cause. They would write massive checks under the table, and Sloan would funnel that money directly to international money launderers to pay off the Russian syndicate. The absolute audacity of the plan made my blood boil. They were turning my home into a black market auction house. But the ultimate indignity, the final strike that broke the last chain of my patience, happened in the garage. The camera feed switched to the subterranean climate-controlled garage where I kept my private collection. The heavy steel doors rolled open. 3 men in mechanic uniforms walked inside, led by Trey. My son walked straight past the modern luxury sedans and stopped right in front of the crown jewel of my life, my pristine cherry-red 1969 Ford Mustang. I bought that car with the very first massive logistics contract I ever signed. It was not just a vehicle. It was a symbol of my triumph over poverty. It was the physical proof that a black man from the gritty streets of South Atlanta could build an empire from nothing and win. I spent countless weekends under the hood of that car teaching Trey how to handle a wrench, showing him the value of hard work and maintenance. Now Trey stood in front of that car with dead eyes. He handed the keys to one of the mechanics. The man slid into the driver's seat and fired up the engine. The powerful roar of the classic muscle car echoed through the hidden microphones. They slowly rolled the Mustang out of the garage and into the bright afternoon sunlight, parking it right in the center of the mansion courtyard. It was going to be the main attraction of their desperate auction, the centerpiece of their criminal liquidation. I watched my son slap the hood of the car, signaling the appraisal team to catalog it for the evening bidding block. He was selling my soul to save his own miserable skin. I sat back in the cold metal folding chair. The warehouse was silent except for the humming of the computer servers and the distant sound of traffic outside. The sharp stabbing pain in my broken ribs suddenly felt completely insignificant. A different kind of fire was burning inside me now. The waiting game was over. I had seen enough. I had let them dig their own graves deep enough. They had forged the documents. They had engaged the cartel. They had committed the federal wire fraud. And now they were actively trafficking stolen property across state lines in a desperate bid to cover up their crimes. The trap was fully loaded and the rats were sitting right on top of the trigger. I slowly pushed myself up from the chair, standing tall despite the tight medical bindings wrapped around my chest. Kendrick stepped forward out of the shadows, his massive frame tense and ready for orders. He looked at me and he knew instantly that the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the bleeding victim hiding in a warehouse. I was the chief executive officer of Cole Logistics, and it was time to clean house. I walked over to the small garment bag hanging on a metal rack in the corner of the room. Vivian had packed it 3 weeks ago when she prepared this safe house. I unzipped the black canvas and pulled out the suit inside. It was my tailored charcoal gray wool suit, the very suit I had explicitly requested in my will to be buried in. It was immaculate, perfectly pressed, and dark as a thundercloud. I slipped off the oversized gray sweatshirt I had been wearing since the mountain and carefully put on the crisp white dress shirt. The fabric felt like armor settling over my shoulders. I fastened the silk tie, pulling the knot tight against my collar. I slid my arms into the heavy wool jacket. The fit was flawless. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of a blank monitor. I did not look like a 75-year-old man who had survived a fatal drop. I looked like the Grim Reaper coming to collect a massive debt. I reached over to the medical supply table and picked up a solid ebony walking cane with a heavy polished silver handle. I did not actually need it to walk, but it offered the perfect balance to my bruised ribs, and it carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. I gripped the cool silver handle, feeling the solid weight of the wood against the floor. I turned to face my wife. Vivian had closed her laptop and stood up. She was already dressed in a sharp black designer pantsuit, her posture rigid, her eyes blazing with that same ruthless fire. We were completely synchronized. We did not need to discuss the plan. We both knew exactly what had to be done. I looked at Kendrick, who was waiting silently for the final command. The sun outside was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows over the city of Atlanta. The fake charity gala at my estate was scheduled to begin in exactly 2 hours. The wealthy elite, the corrupt buyers, and the cartel fixers would all be gathering in my grand ballroom, sipping my champagne and bidding on my stolen legacy. They thought the king was dead. They were about to learn that the king was just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I gripped the silver handle of the cane and looked Kendrick dead in the eyes. "Call Agent Miller at the FBI." I said, my voice low and completely devoid of mercy. "Tell them we have the wire fraud, the forged POA, and the cartel money laundering on a silver platter. It is time to crash a party." The night air outside the surveillance van was thick with the humidity of a Georgia evening. Inside the cramped metal belly of the mobile command center, the only light came from the glow of tactical monitors and laptops. The air smelled of stale coffee and ozone. I sat on a bolted metal bench next to Vivian, with Kendrick looming in the tight corner, blocking the exit like a gargoyle. Across the narrow metal table sat Special Agent Miller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Miller was a sharp man in his late 40s with tired eyes and a jaw clenched so tight it looked like it was carved from granite. He was staring at the 3 black flash drives sitting on the table between us. I pushed the drives an inch closer to him with the tip of my silver-handled cane. I told him those drives contained the complete anatomy of a murder and a federal financial conspiracy. Vivian leaned forward and explained the contents in her cold, methodical voice. She told Agent Miller the first drive contained the raw audio files from the mountain ledge where our son and his wife conspired to leave us for dead. She told him the second drive held weeks of high-definition hidden camera footage from inside our estate, documenting the forgery of legal documents and the unauthorized auction of our assets. Then she pointed to the third drive. That one, she said, held the encrypted bank routing logs showing the exact moment $30 million of offshore cartel money bounced into a locked federal blind trust. Miller picked up the third drive as if it were a live grenade. He plugged it into his secure terminal and watched the cascading lines of data verify everything we had just claimed. I watched his face transition from professional skepticism to absolute profound shock. He realized he was not just looking at a family dispute over an inheritance. He was looking at a fully documented international money laundering operation served to him on a silver platter. He looked at me and said he had enough evidence to secure federal indictments for everyone inside that mansion. He said his tactical teams were ready to breach the gates and lock down the entire perimeter. I told Agent Miller to hold his teams back. I told him nobody breaches those doors until I walk into that ballroom myself. Miller shook his head immediately and said it was out of the question. He said there were armed Russian cartel fixers mingling with the caterers inside my home, waiting to collect dirty money. He said the situation was far too volatile for 2 unarmed senior citizens to just stroll into the middle of a criminal auction. He said his primary job was to ensure our safety and secure the arrests without civilian casualties. I leaned heavily on my silver-handled cane and locked my eyes onto his. I told him I had spent 40 years building my empire from the dirt of South Atlanta. I told him I had bled for every brick in that mansion and every truck in that fleet. My son threw me off a cliff and was currently standing in my home selling my legacy to thugs to save his bankrupt father-in-law. I told Agent Miller that I did not care about the cartel fixers or the risks. I needed to look my son in the eye before the federal government put handcuffs on him and dragged him away forever. I needed Trey to see the ghost he created. Miller stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He looked at Vivian, who sat perfectly still, radiating a terrifying absolute resolve. He looked at Kendrick, who simply rested his massive hand on the door handle, ready to do whatever I commanded. The federal agent finally sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. He said it was highly irregular and against every tactical protocol in the book. But he also understood the weight of a father needing to close the coffin on his own son. He tapped his watch and gave me his final condition. Miller said I had exactly 5 minutes. He said his teams would move into position around the perimeter of the estate under the cover of darkness. The moment I walked through the main doors of the ballroom, the countdown would begin. 5 minutes to say whatever I needed to say to the boy I raised. When the clock hit 0, his heavily armed agents would storm the building and arrest every single person involved in the conspiracy. I nodded slowly. 5 minutes was all I needed to burn their stolen kingdom to the ground. Kendrick drove us in his matte black vehicle through the back roads surrounding my estate. He killed the headlights a mile out, navigating by moonlight until we reached the dense tree line bordering the rear of the property. The night was eerily quiet except for the crunch of our shoes on the dry leaves. Every step I took sent a dull throb through my taped ribs, but the adrenaline flooding my veins numbed the pain completely. We moved through the heavy shadows of the old oak trees, stepping carefully to avoid triggering the perimeter motion sensors I had installed years ago. We reached the edge of the manicured lawn and stood perfectly still in the darkness. Through the gaps in the trees, I could see my mansion blazing with light. It looked like a palace illuminated for a grand royal celebration. The long, winding driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts were busy parking bright red Ferraris, heavy black Bentleys, and sleek imported sedans. The absolute hypocrisy of the scene made my stomach churn. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were arriving to sip my vintage champagne and bid on my stolen classic cars under the guise of honoring my memory. They thought they were attending the social event of the season. They had no idea they were walking straight into a massive federal sting operation. I watched the front doors of my home. Guests were laughing and handing over their coats to the hired staff. Standing near the massive stone columns flanking the entrance, I spotted them. 2 men in dark tailored suits standing too rigidly to be socialites. They had thick necks and cold, watchful eyes scanning the crowd. The Russian cartel fixers were already inside the perimeter. They were standing guard, waiting for their $30 million to clear. They were waiting for Trey to hand over the untraceable cash generated by the illegal auction of my assets. The trap was fully loaded, and every single rat was exactly where they needed to be. I stood in the cold shadows, watching the lavish criminal enterprise operating in my own front yard. The crisp night air filled my lungs, giving me a chilling, unnatural clarity. I thought about the crushing pain of the mountain ledge. I thought about the desperate gasps for air. I thought about the cruel laughter of my daughter-in-law and the heavy sigh of my son as he walked away, leaving us for dead. The anger had completely vanished, leaving a deep, dark void of pure, absolute resolution. Vivian stood beside me, her black designer suit blending perfectly into the shadows. She looked like an elegant phantom ready to pass judgment on the living. I felt her hand slide into mine. Her fingers were warm and steady, offering the silent, unbreakable support that had carried us through 50 years of marriage. We had built our empire together, and tonight we were going to tear down the parasites who tried to steal it together. I gripped the heavy silver handle of my cane, tightening my fingers until my knuckles ached. I looked at the brilliantly lit mansion where my son was currently playing the grieving heir. I turned my head slowly and looked at my wife. The time for waiting was completely over. I took a slow, deep breath and whispered softly into the dark night, "Let us go to our funeral." We slipped through the heavy service doors at the back of the estate, moving like phantoms through the very halls I had built with my own hands. The air inside the mansion was thick with the scent of roasted meats, expensive truffles, and the overwhelming fragrance of designer perfumes masking the stench of their lies. The muffled sound of a live jazz band drifted down the long marble corridor. It was a smooth, weeping saxophone and a deep, upright bass playing a tune that felt completely hollow. They were playing funeral music for a man who was currently walking right toward them. Vivian walked beside me in absolute silence. Her posture was flawless. We did not look like victims who had survived a fall from a mountain. We looked like the inevitable consequence of their greed. We reached the heavy velvet curtains of the mezzanine overlooking the grand ballroom. I pulled the dark fabric back just an inch so we could look down upon the absolute hypocrisy unfolding in my home. The ballroom was bathed in the warm golden glow of the massive Italian crystal chandeliers I had bought for Vivian on our 30th anniversary. Below us, the wealthy elite of Atlanta mingled and laughed. These were the politicians who used to call my office begging for campaign donations. These were the real estate moguls who used to look down their noses at my work boots when I first started buying commercial property. Now they were all standing on my imported Persian rugs, sipping my vintage champagne and wearing their finest tailored suits and silk evening gowns. They were completely oblivious to the reality of the room. They thought they were attending the most exclusive social event of the season, a beautiful, tragic charity gala to honor a fallen titan of industry. They had no idea they were standing in the middle of a massive black market liquidation. They had no idea that the ground beneath their expensive leather shoes was rigged with federal dynamite. They were just vultures picking at the bones of my legacy, believing the feast was completely legal. My eyes scanned the sea of wealth and fake sympathy until I found my son. Trey was standing near a towering ice sculpture in the corner of the room. He looked absolutely pathetic. He was sweating profusely through his custom-tailored black tuxedo. The collar of his crisp white shirt was soaked. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows waiting for the heavy wooden lever to be pulled. He held a crystal glass filled to the brim with amber whiskey, and he was throwing it down his throat as if he were trying to drown the sheer terror burning inside his chest. His hands were shaking so violently that the ice cubes rattled constantly against the glass. Trey was not mingling with the politicians. He was not smiling at the real estate moguls. He was completely trapped in a suffocating nightmare of his own making. I watched him swallow hard, his chest heaving with panic. I followed his nervous, terrified gaze across the crowded room to understand exactly what was causing him to break down in the middle of his own party. Standing near the heavy oak exit doors at the back of the ballroom were the cartel fixers. The Russian men wore dark suits that stretched tight across their massive shoulders. They did not hold champagne glasses. They did not speak to the socialites. They were cold, silent sentinels, waiting for their $30 million. They stood perfectly still, ignoring the jazz music and the wealthy elite. The lead Russian caught Trey looking at him from across the crowded room. The man did not move a single muscle in his face. He simply maintained dead eye contact with my son and slowly lifted his left arm. He tapped the glass face of his heavy silver watch with his index finger. Tap, tap, tap. The silent message was incredibly clear. Time was running out. The 48-hour deadline to replace the stolen money was closing in fast. Trey turned the color of old, wet ash. He looked away immediately, terrified, clutching his chest as if he could feel his own heart failing him. He threw his parents off a mountain to secure his place in this high society world, and now he was realizing that this beautiful, aristocratic world was going to be his graveyard. A soft, elegant chime rang through the ballroom, suddenly silencing the jazz band and the quiet murmurs of the crowd. All attention turned toward the grand stage set up at the far end of the room. Sloane walked up the steps and stepped into the bright spotlight. She wore a stunning black evening gown that clung perfectly to her figure. She looked absolutely flawless. She looked like a grieving angel descending from the heavens to bless the crowd with her sorrow. She walked to the center of the stage and grabbed the microphone with both hands, taking a deep, trembling breath. The entire ballroom went completely silent out of profound respect for her fabricated grief. She looked out over the crowd of wealthy buyers and let a single perfect tear roll down her pale cheek. She began to speak, her voice echoing softly and mournfully through the massive speakers. She told the crowd how much she missed her beloved in-laws. She told them that Preston and Vivian Cole were not just titans of the logistics industry, but pillars of the Atlanta community who treated her like their own flesh and blood. She wiped her fake tear away with a delicate lace handkerchief, acting the part of the devastated daughter-in-law with Oscar-worthy precision. Sloane told the silent room that we loved giving back to the city more than anything else in the world. She said that tonight this charity auction was not just a sale of our personal assets, but a beautiful celebration of our philanthropic legacy. It was a masterful, deeply sickening performance. She was selling my life, my classic cars, and my wife diamond collection to pay off international money launderers, and she was making the city elite applaud her for doing it. The hypocrisy was so incredibly thick you could practically choke on it. She motioned gracefully to the side of the stage where a massive black velvet drape covered a large, heavy object. Two uniformed workers stepped forward and pulled the drape away. Beneath the velvet sat my pristine cherry-red 1969 Ford Mustang. The classic muscle car gleamed under the bright stage lights, a beautiful, tangible testament to my decades of brutal, hard labor. That car was the very first thing I bought when I realized I was not going to die poor in the dirt of South Atlanta. I spent thousands of hours under the hood of that machine. It was my victory lap. The wealthy crowd gasped and murmured in deep appreciation at the sight of the flawless vintage vehicle. Sloane smiled a fake brave smile and lifted a heavy wooden auctioneer gavel from the podium. She told the crowd that all proceeds tonight would go directly to a special private trust to honor my memory. A trust that everyone hiding in the dark warehouse knew was just a desperate front to funnel untraceable cash to the Russian syndicate waiting by the doors. She was trading the symbol of my life's hard work to save her bankrupt aristocratic family from the cartel. I gripped the silver handle of my cane. I felt Vivian step close to my side, her presence a silent command that the waiting was finally over. The time for hiding in the shadows had passed. I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains of the mezzanine and walked directly to the edge of the balcony where everyone in the grand ballroom below could clearly see me standing above them. Sloane raised the wooden gavel high above her head. Her voice rang out clear and arrogant across the silent, breathless ballroom. "Do I hear 1 million for the classic collection?" she asked into the microphone. 1 million to honor the legacy of Preston Cole. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the cold air of absolute vengeance. I looked down at the woman who tried to murder me and the son who stood by and let her do it. I let my voice drop into a deep, booming thunder that echoed through the entire ballroom, completely shattering the pristine silence of her fake memorial. "I think my cars are worth a hell of a lot more than that, Sloane." The echo of my voice rolled through the massive ballroom like a sudden crack of thunder. "I think my cars are worth a hell of a lot more than that, Sloane." The words bounced off the vaulted ceilings and shattered the pristine, fake atmosphere of their high society charity auction. Up on the mezzanine, I did not wait for her to respond. I turned away from the balcony edge. I looked at Vivian and she nodded. We walked down the sweeping marble staircase, moving step by step toward the main entrance of the grand ballroom. My ribs burned with a blinding white-hot agony every time my leather shoes hit the marble stairs. But I did not care. The adrenaline pumping through my veins was stronger than any pain medication. I was a dead man walking back into my own house to reclaim my throne. We reached the ground floor. Ahead of us stood the massive, heavy mahogany doors that separated the foyer from the grand ballroom. I bought those doors from a historic estate in Savannah 30 years ago. They were thick, solid wood built to withstand a hurricane. Tonight, they were the only thing standing between my murderous son and absolute justice. I gripped the heavy silver handle of my cane. I placed my other hand flat against the cool, polished wood of the door. Vivian stood right beside me, her posture perfect, her face carved from cold stone. She placed her hand on the opposite door. We pushed them open together. The heavy mahogany doors swung wide open with a loud, echoing groan that cut through the air. I walked in leaning heavily on my silver-handled cane. The scene inside the ballroom was something I will remember until the day I take my true final breath. The live jazz band playing in the corner stopped completely abruptly. The saxophone player froze with his instrument halfway to his mouth. The man plucking the deep, upright bass missed a note, letting out a harsh, discordant twang before his hands went completely still. The silence that fell over the room was not just quiet. It was a suffocating, heavy vacuum. It was the sound of 300 wealthy elite socialites holding their collective breath, all at the exact same time. Somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a wealthy woman in a silk evening gown gasped. The expensive crystal champagne glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor and shattered loudly. The sharp breaking sound echoed like a gunshot in the dead silent room. Nobody moved to clean it up. Nobody even looked at the broken glass. Every single pair of eyes in that massive ballroom was locked directly on me. They were looking at a ghost. They were looking at a man they had just held a memorial service for. They were looking at a man whose body was supposed to be rotting at the bottom of a freezing mountain river. Up on the grand stage, Sloane was completely paralyzed. The arrogant, victorious smile she had worn just seconds ago was entirely wiped from her flawless, pale face. The fake tears she had shed for the audience dried up, instantly replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her perfectly manicured fingers began to tremble so violently that the heavy wooden auctioneer gavel slipped from her grip. The gavel hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, heavy thud and rolled away, coming to a stop near the tires of my cherry-red classic Mustang. Sloane took a staggering step backward, her high heels catching on the hem of her expensive black designer dress. She looked like a trapped animal, realizing the cage door had just locked behind her. But the most pathetic sight in the entire room was my son. Trey was standing near the towering ice sculpture in the corner of the ballroom. I turned my head and locked my eyes directly on him. He was holding a crystal glass filled with my $2,000 bourbon. When he saw me walking through those mahogany doors, his entire body went completely rigid. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, sweaty corpse. The crystal whiskey glass slipped right out of his trembling hands. It crashed onto the marble floor, spilling amber liquid and ice cubes everywhere. Trey did not even blink. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, looking exactly as if he had just seen a demon rise from the depths of hell. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with crushing, absolute force. He realized in that exact moment that his perfect murder plan was a complete failure. He realized the father he threw off a cliff was standing right in front of him. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The loud, sharp clack of my silver-handled cane hitting the hardwood floor echoed through the silent ballroom. I took another step. Clack. Then another. Clack. I did not rush. I had all the time in the world. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom with Vivian right beside me. The crowd of politicians, real estate moguls, and high society elites parted for us like the Red Sea. They scrambled backward, pushing against each other just to get out of our way. The wealthy men and women who had ignored my calls when I was a struggling truck driver in South Atlanta now shrunk away from me in absolute awe and terror. They pressed themselves against the banquet tables and the walls, not daring to breathe, not daring to speak a single word. I kept my eyes locked solely on my son. I did not look at the corrupt city officials. I did not look at the greedy business partners who were ready to buy my stolen assets for pennies on the dollar. I did not even look at the Russian cartel fixers standing near the back exit who were currently realizing that their $30 million untraceable transaction was completely dead. The Russian fixers slowly backed into the shadows, knowing that a resurrected billionaire walking into his own memorial service meant the federal authorities were not far behind. They knew the deal was over. But I did not care about the cartel right now. I only cared about the boy I raised. Every step down that center aisle brought back a memory. I remembered carrying Trey on my back when he was a toddler, laughing as we walked through the park. Clack. I remembered buying him his first baseball glove, working overtime to afford the genuine leather. Clack. I remembered paying for his expensive private college tuition so he would never have to sweat in the Georgia sun like his father did. Clack. I took all of those beautiful, warm memories and I crushed them under my expensive leather shoes. The boy in those memories was completely dead. The man standing near the ice sculpture, shivering in his custom tuxedo, was nothing but a cowardly thief who tried to kill his own mother and father for a taste of white elite approval. I reached the front of the ballroom and stopped right at the edge of the grand stage. The vintage red Mustang sat between me and the woman who tried to orchestrate my death. Sloane was backed up against the stage curtains, shaking uncontrollably. I did not say a word to her. She was nothing to me. She was just a parasite who found a willing host in my weak son. I turned my body and faced Trey. He was standing just a few feet away from the stage, his chest heaving, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Trey looked at my face. He looked at the bruises on my neck. He looked at the way I favored my left side due to my crushed ribs. He looked at Vivian, standing tall and unbreakable beside me, wearing the dirt and blood of the mountain like a badge of absolute honor. The sheer weight of his guilt and his terrifying reality finally broke his legs. Trey let out a pathetic, broken sob. His knees buckled underneath him. He collapsed right there on the wet marble floor, surrounded by the shattered glass of his whiskey and the melting ice cubes. The executive vice president of my $50 million empire was kneeling in a puddle of spilled liquor in front of the entire Atlanta high society. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. He tried to put his mask back on. He tried to play the role of the innocent, grieving son one last desperate time. "Dad," he stammered, his voice cracking pitifully. "Mom, you are alive. Oh my God, you are alive. Thank God. We thought we lost you. We thought you were gone forever." He reached out a trembling hand toward my pant leg, trying to grab onto me, playing the part of the relieved child. The entire ballroom was dead silent, hanging on his every pathetic word. They were waiting for the emotional family reunion. They were waiting for the father to drop his cane and embrace the son who thought he was an orphan. But I did not drop my cane. I did not reach out to comfort him. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the miserable creature kneeling in front of me. I felt absolutely zero pity. I felt absolutely zero love. The void inside my chest was vast and freezing cold. I looked at the tears streaming down his face. I looked at his shaking hands. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. The microphones on the stage picked up my words and broadcast them crystal clear across the silent, breathless ballroom. I spoke into the dead silence with lethal, absolute calm. Save the acting tray. We all know how we got to the bottom of that cliff. The words hung in the air like a heavy executioner's axe. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom somehow grew even deeper. Nobody dared to cough. Nobody dared to whisper. The wealthy socialites, the corrupt politicians, and the greedy business partners stood frozen in shock as they processed the magnitude of what I had just said. I was not just a survivor of a tragic hiking accident interrupting my own memorial service. I was a victim publicly accusing my only son of attempted murder in front of 300 witnesses. I watched the fake relief on Trey's face evaporate instantly. The lie died right there on his lips. He could not maintain the facade anymore. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror as he realized that I remembered everything. He realized that the traumatic fall did not erase my memory. I remembered the scenic overlook. I remembered the cold wind. I remembered the violent, forceful shove against my spine. And most importantly, I remembered the sound of his voice confirming our deaths to his arrogant wife. Sloane let out a small, terrified whimper from the stage behind me. She was clutching the velvet curtain, her perfect aristocratic posture entirely destroyed. The wealthy elite crowd began to realize the true nature of the charity auction they were attending. They started looking at Sloane and Trey with expressions of disgust and fear. The high society gala had transformed into a crime scene in a matter of seconds. They knew they were standing in the middle of a massive criminal conspiracy, and the federal authorities were the only logical next step. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my son. I did not blink. I did not waver. I let the crushing weight of his betrayal press down on him until he could not breathe. He was kneeling in his own spilled whiskey, a pathetic, broken man who traded his soul for an illusion. The mahogany doors remained closed behind me, sealing the ballroom. The trap was fully sprung. The rats were completely cornered, and the ghost of Preston Cole was finally ready to collect his debt. The silence in the grand ballroom was so absolute it felt like the air had been sucked completely out of the room. My son remained on his knees in the puddle of his own spilled whiskey. He was staring up at me with a face completely devoid of blood or hope. He knew there was no escape. He knew the carefully constructed lie he had built with his aristocratic wife was completely shattered. I did not move to help him up. I did not offer a single ounce of fatherly comfort. I simply reached my free hand into the inside pocket of my tailored charcoal gray suit jacket. Every eye in that massive room followed my movement. The politicians, the wealthy real estate developers, the socialites, they all watched me with bated breath. They thought I was reaching for a handkerchief. They thought I was reaching for a medical device. They had no idea I was reaching for the trigger that would blow their entire criminal high society auction to absolute pieces. I pulled out a small black plastic remote control. It was a simple device Vivian had synced to the audio-visual system of the mansion earlier that evening. Behind the stage, where my daughter-in-law Sloane was currently pressing her back against the heavy velvet curtains, there was a massive high-definition projector screen. For the past 2 hours, that screen had been displaying a beautiful looping slideshow of my life. It showed pictures of me and Vivian cutting ribbons at charity hospitals. It showed me standing proudly in front of my very first logistics truck. It showed fake, beautifully curated memories designed to make the audience feel generous and sympathetic, so they would bid higher on my stolen classic cars and diamonds. It was a monument to their hypocrisy. I held the small black remote in my hand and I pressed the central button. The beautiful slideshow vanished instantly. The giant screen behind Sloane went completely pitch black. The sudden darkness on the stage made the crowd gasp in confusion. The soft, warm lighting of the ballroom seemed to grow cold. I pressed a second button on the remote, and the master audio system of my estate crackled to life. Vivian had wired the transmission directly into the high-fidelity surround sound speakers hidden in the vaulted ceilings. At first, the crowd just heard the sound of a bitter, freezing wind. It was the raw, unedited audio captured by the miniature recorder Vivian had sewn into her coat lining on the day of our attempted murder. The sound of the howling mountain wind filled the elegant ballroom. It sounded incredibly harsh and violent, contrasting sickeningly with the smell of expensive perfume and roasted truffles. The wealthy elite looked around in confusion, trying to understand what they were listening to. Then a voice cut through the sound of the wind. It was crystal clear and amplified to perfection. It was a woman speaking with a tone of pure, calculating ice. "Are they dead?" The voice echoed off the marble walls and the crystal chandeliers. Every single person in that ballroom instantly recognized that voice. It was the exact same voice that had just been standing at the podium weeping fake tears and begging for charity bids just moments ago. It was Sloane. I watched Sloane as her own voice rained down from the ceiling. Her eyes widened so far I thought they might tear. She covered her mouth with both of her trembling hands, letting out a muffled shriek of pure horror. She looked at the speakers hidden in the ceiling as if they were monsters descending to devour her. The audio recording continued playing mercilessly. Her voice echoed again, asking if I breathed a word to my lawyers before Monday her father would go under completely. She demanded to know if we were dead so they could liquidate the company. The 300 elite guests in the ballroom froze completely. The realization struck the crowd like a physical shockwave. The elegant men and women who had been drinking my vintage champagne suddenly understood they were not listening to a memorial tribute. They were listening to a recorded murder conspiracy. A woman in the front row pressed her hand against her chest, taking a stumbling step backward. A wealthy city councilman lowered his glass, his mouth falling open in sheer absolute disgust. But the recording was not finished. The speakers crackled again, and this time a different voice answered the cold demands of the woman. It was the voice of a man sounding inconvenienced and eager to leave the scene of a crime. They hit the rocks. "It is over. Let us go pack up the house." It was Trey, my only son, the boy I had protected and provided for his entire life. His voice echoed through the grand ballroom, delivering the ultimate confirmation of his total betrayal. He did not sound remorseful on the recording. He sounded like he was checking a chore off a list. Trey was still kneeling on the marble floor right in front of me. When he heard his own voice broadcasting his patricide to the entire Atlanta high society, he let out a guttural, agonizing wail. He buried his face in his hands, pressing his forehead against the cold, wet marble floor. He curled into a tight, pathetic ball, trembling violently. He was entirely broken. His reputation, his marriage, his freedom, his entire existence was completely incinerated in front of the most powerful people in the city. The reaction of the crowd was instantaneous and completely visceral. The elite socialites, the bankers, the developers, they all began to physically recoil from the stage and from the center aisle. They backed away from Sloane and Trey as if the two of them were suddenly infected with a highly contagious, deadly plague. The physical space around my son opened up, leaving him completely isolated in a wide circle of pure shame. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near them. Nobody wanted to be associated with the monsters who pushed their own parents off a mountain to steal a logistics empire. The murmurs of the crowd turned into loud gasps of horror and loud, angry whispers of total revulsion. I stood tall, leaning on my silver-handled cane, and I watched the absolute destruction of their false kingdom. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for ruining their lives. They had earned every single second of this public execution. They thought they could erase me from the world and dance on my grave. I was just returning the favor. Near the heavy oak exit doors at the back of the ballroom, the atmosphere was entirely different. The Russian cartel fixers were not gasping in horror. They were not whispering in disgust. They were highly trained, ruthless criminals, and they instantly recognized the smell of a massive burning federal trap. They realized immediately that they had been dragged into an incredibly loud public murder conspiracy. They realized the man they were supposed to buy the stolen trucks from was currently kneeling on the floor, while his own recorded voice confessed to homicide over the loudspeakers. Even worse, they realized the dead man who owned the company was standing right there, controlling the entire room. The lead Russian fixer locked eyes with me from across the massive ballroom. I did not break eye contact. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod, letting him know that I knew exactly who he was and exactly why he was in my house. The color drained from the fixer's face. He knew that if I was alive and broadcasting this level of evidence, the authorities were absolutely involved. He tapped his thick fingers against the shoulder of his muscle men. They immediately turned around, keeping their hands hidden inside their dark tailored jackets, and began moving swiftly toward the heavy exit doors. They wanted to slip out into the night and vanish before the federal agents closed the net. They wanted to abandon their $30 million and run for their lives. But I knew the heavy doors they were walking toward were already dead-bolted from the outside. There was absolutely no escape for anyone. Suddenly, a loud, frantic shout broke through the chaotic murmuring of the wealthy crowd. It came from the side of the grand stage. Richard Vanderbilt, the bankrupt aristocratic patriarch, pushed his way past a group of terrified catering staff. His expensive trench coat was unbuttoned, and his face was flushed a deep, angry crimson. He was sweating profusely, panting as he scrambled up the steps of the stage to stand protectively in front of his trembling daughter. Richard pointed a shaking, desperate finger directly at me. His eyes were wide with sheer panic and cornered rage. "It is a fake," Richard screamed, his voice cracking as he yelled into the massive ballroom. "Do not listen to him. It is a deep fake. It is artificially generated audio. This man is out of his mind. He is trying to frame my daughter and my son-in-law to cover up his own financial crimes. He is insane." The crowd murmured, looking back and forth between me and the frantic, desperate man on the stage. Richard was grasping at straws, throwing the most ridiculous lies into the air, hoping anything would stick and save his family from federal prison. He was trying to protect the dirty money and the illegal auction that was supposed to save his collapsing real estate empire. I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I did not need to defend my evidence. I slowly lifted my silver-handled cane and pointed the heavy polished tip directly at Richard Vanderbilt's chest. I looked at the sweating, bankrupt coward, and I smirked. It was a cold, dark smile that carried the weight of absolute victory. "You might want to save your breath, Vanderbilt," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "Because the men waiting outside are not here for the auction." Richard frowned, his frantic mind struggling to process my words. He looked toward the heavy glass windows of the ballroom. In the far distance, breaking through the quiet Georgia night, a low, wailing sound began to rise. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and sharper with every passing second. It was the undeniable, piercing shriek of federal sirens. Multiple sirens approaching the estate from every possible direction, echoing through the trees and tearing through the dark sky. The sound was rapidly getting closer, surrounding the entire property like an unbreakable wall of flashing red and blue lights. The trap was springing shut. The federal agents were moving in, and the public execution was officially complete. The wail of the approaching sirens grew deafening, tearing through the quiet Georgia night and echoing off the grand walls of my estate. The flashing red and blue emergency lights painted the high, vaulted windows of the ballroom in frantic, chaotic strokes. The wealthy elite of Atlanta, who had been sipping my vintage champagne and bidding on my stolen legacy just moments ago, suddenly realized they were trapped inside a massive cage. Pure, unadulterated panic erupted across the room. Men in expensive tailored tuxedos and women in silk evening gowns shoved each other mercilessly, trying to reach the side exits, but they found every single door heavily barricaded from the outside. The jazz band members dropped their brass instruments and backed slowly against the far wall, raising their hands in surrender. Then the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance completely blew open. It was not a polite entrance. It was a violent, explosive breach. Dozens of federal tactical agents wearing dark assault gear and heavy bulletproof vests flooded into the grand ballroom like a tidal wave of absolute justice. Their heavy combat boots trampled mercilessly over the imported Persian rugs, crushing the fallen champagne glasses underfoot. They moved with perfect military precision, fanning out across the massive room, their tactical rifles raised and their flashlights cutting through the dim, romantic lighting of the gala. They shouted deafening commands that echoed over the high-pitched screams of the terrified socialites, demanding that nobody move and that everyone keep their hands clearly visible. The sheer, overwhelming volume of their voices completely drowned out the pathetic whimpering of my son, who was still kneeling in the puddle of his own spilled whiskey. I leaned heavily on my silver-handled cane and turned my gaze toward the back of the room where the Russian cartel fixers had been standing. They were seasoned international criminals, and they knew exactly what a federal raid looked like. The lead buyer, the man who had placed a suppressed pistol on my mahogany desk just hours earlier, made a sudden, desperate sprint toward the kitchen service hallway. He did not make it 3 steps. A highly trained squad of federal agents intercepted him with ruthless, brutal efficiency. They tackled the massive Russian dead center, sending his heavy body crashing right through a banquet table covered in crystal champagne flutes and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The glass shattered everywhere, raining down on the terrified wealthy guests who threw themselves to the marble floor to avoid the chaotic crossfire. The federal agents pinned the struggling cartel fixers to the ground, driving their knees into the backs of the criminals and securing their thick wrists with heavy plastic zip ties. The agents expertly stripped the concealed, suppressed weapons from inside the tailored jackets of the fixers, tossing the guns safely out of reach. The cartel money launderers were completely neutralized right there on my ballroom floor, their $30 million untraceable transaction officially dead and buried inside a locked federal vault. Up on the grand stage, the illusion of the untouchable aristocratic Vanderbilt family was violently ripped to absolute shreds. Richard Vanderbilt, the bankrupt patriarch who had arrogantly demanded the liquidation of my life's work, stood totally paralyzed as two federal agents marched directly up the stage steps. He tried to speak. He tried to invoke his wealth and his supposed political connections, sputtering frantic nonsense about banking errors and deepfake audio recordings. The agents did not care about his country club memberships or his historic bloodline. They grabbed his arms and spun him around, forcefully slamming him face first against the very wooden podium his daughter had just used to sell my legacy. They slapped cold, heavy steel handcuffs on his wrists, loudly reading him his rights for federal wire fraud and international money laundering. Victoria Vanderbilt, his snobby, complicit wife, let out a horrified, piercing shriek as another tactical agent secured her hands behind her back, ignoring her demands to speak to the chief of police. Their bankrupt empire was finally exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of a massive federal indictment. They were no longer the elite, untouchable royalty of Atlanta. They were just common, desperate thieves caught holding an empty bag. And then there was Sloane, the beautiful, cold-hearted woman who had manipulated my son and orchestrated my murder just to save her miserable family. She was backed tightly against the heavy velvet stage curtains, her pristine white designer dress now rumpled and stained with nervous sweat. When the federal agents approached her, she completely lost her mind. The polished, elegant facade of a high society lady evaporated entirely, leaving nothing but a frantic, cornered animal. She kicked and thrashed wildly, screaming hysterically at the top of her lungs. She demanded a lawyer. She screamed that she was a Vanderbilt and that these working-class agents had absolutely no right to touch her. When she realized her screaming was useless, she pointed a trembling, frantic finger down at my son. She yelled that Trey was the one who signed the forged documents, that Trey was the one who authorized the cartel transfer, that Trey was the mastermind. She was throwing her husband to the wolves without a single second of hesitation, trying to trade his freedom for her own. The federal agents did not listen to her entitled tantrums. They grabbed her thrashing arms and forcefully shoved her against the polished wood of the stage wall. They wrenched her delicate hands behind her back and clicked the heavy metal handcuffs shut, locking her in place. Her pristine, untouchable image was entirely shattered. She was weeping openly, her expensive mascara running down her pale face in dark, ugly streaks, looking absolutely pathetic as she was dragged roughly down the stage steps like a common street criminal. I stood dead center in the middle of the absolute chaos, Vivian standing resolute and unbreakable right by my side. We watched the total destruction of the people who had tried to erase us from the earth. Then I felt something tugging weakly at the hem of my tailored charcoal gray trousers. I looked down. Trey was crawling toward me across the wet marble floor. He was literally dragging his knees through the spilled alcohol and his own sickness. His expensive custom tuxedo was ruined, covered in filth and ultimate shame. He looked up at me with a face completely distorted by absolute terror and a desperate, pathetic kind of grief. He was sobbing uncontrollably, thick, heavy tears streaming down his face, mixing with the cold sweat on his forehead. He reached out with both of his shaking hands and grabbed onto my pant leg, clutching the fine wool fabric as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling into the fires of hell. "Dad, please," he wailed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic squeal that carried over the shouting of the federal agents. "Dad, you have to stop them. You have to tell them it was not my fault. It was her. She manipulated me. She made me do it. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you, Dad. I am your son. I am your blood. Please do not let them take me away." He begged and pleaded, abandoning every single ounce of dignity he had left in his body. He blamed his wife. He blamed the money. He blamed everything in the world except his own greedy, murderous heart. He actually thought appealing to my blood would save him. He thought the father who had worked 80-hour weeks breathing diesel fumes to pay for his Ivy League college tuition would suddenly reappear and shield him from the devastating consequences of his own actions. He thought I was still the man who would sacrifice absolutely anything for his child. I looked down at the pathetic, whimpering creature groveling in the dirt at my feet. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel sorrow or grief. I felt an absolute freezing, empty void. The unconditional love that had defined my life for 38 years was completely, entirely gone. I slowly reached down with my free hand. I grabbed Trey by the wrist. I did not strike him. I did not yell. I gently but firmly pried his shaking fingers off my suit one by one, breaking his desperate grip. I stepped backward, creating a physical distance between us that perfectly mirrored the eternal void he had created in my soul. I looked straight down into his terrified, weeping eyes. I spoke slowly, letting every single syllable sink deep into his marrow so he would remember it for the rest of his miserable life in a federal cell. My son died when he pushed me into the abyss. The man standing here is just the guy who owns the trucks. Two massive federal agents stepped forward and grabbed Trey by the shoulders, hauling him roughly to his feet. He had no strength left in his legs to support himself. They dragged him backward across the marble floor, pulling him away from me and toward the heavy mahogany doors. Trey kicked his legs and screamed my name over and over again, his agonizing, desperate wails echoing through the ruined ballroom as the federal authorities hauled him out into the cold, dark night. 6 months passed since the night the federal agents kicked down my mahogany doors. The wheels of justice usually grind slow, but when you hand the federal government a perfectly wrapped package of wire fraud, money laundering, and attempted murder, the gears turn with absolute merciless speed. The trial was not a battle. It was a complete slaughter. Sloan and her arrogant, aristocratic parents stood in the federal courthouse stripped of their tailored suits and designer dresses. They wore the same coarse orange jumpsuits as every other criminal in the system. The judge did not care about the Vanderbilt family name. He did not care about the historic buildings they used to own. He looked at the mountain of evidence Vivian and I collected. He listened to the crystal-clear audio of Sloan complaining about my ghetto aesthetic while planning to leave us to rot at the bottom of a river gorge. He sentenced Sloan and her parents to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. They will spend the rest of their natural lives eating terrible food and sleeping on thin mattresses. Then came my son. Trey stood before the judge weeping like a beaten dog. He begged for mercy. He blamed his wife. He blamed the pressure of the high society world. But the judge simply looked down at him with pure disgust and handed him a 20-year sentence. A lifetime behind cold steel bars for a man who used to complain if the air conditioning in his luxury sport utility vehicle took too long to turn on. I only visited him one time. It was a cold, rainy Tuesday when Kendrick drove me to the federal prison facility. I walked through the heavy metal detectors and sat down in the sterile visitor room separated from the inmates by thick, bulletproof glass. Trey walked out of the holding cell. His shoulders were hunched. He had lost weight. He looked terrified. When he saw me sitting there, his eyes lit up with a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope. He thought I was there to offer him a lifeline. He thought the father who had protected him his entire life had finally come to forgive him. He sat down on his side of the glass and eagerly picked up the black plastic telephone receiver, waiting for me to do the same. I did not pick up the phone. I did not want to hear his voice ever again. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my coat and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I slid it through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the glass partition. Trey put the phone down and picked up the envelope with trembling hands. He opened it and pulled out the legal documents inside. I watched his eyes scan the papers. I watched the final ounce of hope completely drain from his soul. The documents were entirely finalized court orders. I had legally disowned him. I had completely stripped him of his inheritance and removed his access to any trust fund. But the final document was the one that broke him. It was a binding legal order stripping him of the Cole family last name. He was no longer my son in blood, and he was no longer my son in name. He was just an inmate with a number. Trey pressed his hands against the thick glass, sobbing uncontrollably, begging me with his eyes to pick up the phone. I stood up from my metal chair, buttoned my suit jacket, and turned my back on him. I walked out of the visitor room, and I did not look back a single time. The ghost was completely gone. When the trial was over, Vivian and I walked through the massive, empty halls of our estate in Buckhead. The mansion was beautiful, but it was tainted. It felt like a museum dedicated to a life we no longer wanted to live. We realized we did not need the excessive space. We did not need the grand ballroom or the sprawling guest wings. We called a real estate broker and liquidated the entire property. We sold the imported Persian rugs, the antique furniture, and the massive crystal chandeliers. We only kept the things that truly mattered. We kept the old family photographs that Sloan had thrown in the garbage. And I kept my cherry red 1969 Mustang. We moved far away from the city limits. We bought a quiet, beautiful lake house completely hidden by acres of tall Georgia pine trees. Kendrick brought in an elite team to turn the property into a highly secured fortress. We have perimeter sensors, biometric locks, and reinforced gates. Nobody gets within a mile of our home without us knowing about it. But inside the walls, it is incredibly peaceful. There are no high society charity galas. There are no fake friends drinking our champagne. There is only the sound of the wind blowing through the trees and the gentle lapping of the lake water against the wooden dock. But a man who spent 40 years building an empire cannot just sit still and watch the water. I had a $50 million logistics company generating massive profits every single day. I had a fortune and absolutely no blood heirs to leave it to. So Vivian and I made a decision. If you do not have an heir, you have the ultimate power to choose one. I took the massive wealth of my logistics empire and I created the Coal Foundation. I did not want to give money to giant faceless charities. I wanted to build an army. We dedicated the foundation strictly to providing full-ride college scholarships and massive business grants to young, hardworking African-American men and women right here in Atlanta. I go through the applications myself. I look for the kids who are working night shifts, sweeping floors, driving delivery trucks, and trying to pay for community college. I look for the kids who know what it feels like to have calluses on their hands and big dreams in their hearts. When I find them, I change their lives completely. I pay their tuition in full. I give them the seed money to start their own businesses. I give them the opportunities I had to fight and bleed for. I am taking the wealth that my son tried to steal to impress a bankrupt white aristocratic family, and I am using it to build the next generation of proud, strong black leaders. They are my true heirs now. They are the ones who will carry my legacy forward. They will build their own empires, and they will know the absolute value of every single dollar they earn. The sun is beginning to set over the lake, casting a brilliant orange and purple glow across the calm water. I am sitting on the back porch of our new home, resting in a heavy wooden rocking chair. Vivian is sitting right beside me. She looks beautiful and perfectly at peace. I reach over and take her hand. Her fingers are warm and familiar, interlocking completely with mine. Dark gray clouds are starting to roll in from the west, blocking out the sunset. The weather is turning. A cold, heavy rain begins to fall, tapping rhythmically against the wooden roof of the porch. Whenever the temperature drops and the rain comes down, the deep scars on my ribcage begin to ache. It is a dull, throbbing pain exactly where the bones were shattered on that freezing mountain ledge. It is a permanent physical reminder of the ultimate betrayal. It is a reminder of the son who shoved me into the abyss and walked away laughing. I feel the ache in my chest, but I do not feel any sorrow. I breathe in the cool, fresh rain air, and I look out at the dark water. My mind is finally at complete, absolute peace. The noise is gone. The poison is gone. The heavy, suffocating burden of trying to buy the love of a selfish, ungrateful child has been lifted from my shoulders forever. I squeeze my wife's hand and listen to the rain. The cancer was cut out, and the host survived. The screen fades to black. The greatest lesson I learned from the bottom of that freezing mountain gorge is that blood does not automatically make someone family. We spend our entire lives trying to buy the love and respect of our children, sacrificing our own peace to give them a world they never had to sweat for. But true love cannot be bought with trust funds or luxury cars. When you give someone everything without teaching them the value of struggle, you do not build a legacy. You build a parasite. Protect your peace guard, your empire. And remember that sometimes the most toxic people in your life are the ones sitting at your own dinner table. Choose your family based on loyalty, not biology. If you have ever had to cut toxic relatives out of your life to protect your own peace, let me know in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival and absolute justice. Ciao.